The Florida humidity usually smells of salt air, but on this August night, it was thick with the metallic tang of blood. When the first deputy stepped into the driveway, the flashlight beam revealed a scene that defied every law of nature. A young man, muscular, barely clothed, was hunched over a motionless body. He wasn't just attacking, he was tearing at the victim's face with his teeth, snarling through a mouthful of human flesh. It took 4 officers and a K-9 to pry this golden boy away from a meal he claimed was something else entirely. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. To the neighbors in Jupiter, Florida, Austin Harif was the living embodiment of the suburban dream. Born on December 21, 1996, in Palm Beach Gardens, he grew up in a world of manicured lawns and professional success. His father, Wade, was a prominent local dentist, a man often described as boisterous and hardworking, while his mother, Mina, was the nurturing core of the family home. For years, the Harif household appeared stable, anchored by the expectations of high achievement that come with a comfortable middle-class upbringing. Austin and his younger sister, Haley, were close, navigating a childhood that seemed, by all accounts, unremarkable in its normalcy. However, the quiet facade began to show its first hairline fractures when Austin was 13, as his parents navigated a divorce that split his world in two. Despite the separation, Austin remained high-achieving, enrolling at Suncoast Community High School, a prestigious magnet school known for its rigorous academic standards. He wasn't just a face in the crowd, he was a 3.3 GPA student who found his footing through the raw physicality of high school sports. Initially a shy and reserved freshman, he transformed himself through the wrestling team and the football field, using the weight room to carve out a new, more confident identity. By his senior year, he had traded his adolescent insecurity for a muscular frame and a social circle that saw him as a golden boy, the kind of kid destined for a bright future in medicine or sports science. That path led him to Florida State University in Tallahassee, where he initially declared a major in biology. He joined the Alpha Delta Phi fraternity, fully immersing himself in the quintessential American college experience, tailgates, frat parties, and the pressure to maintain a certain alpha persona. But beneath the surface of the gym selfies and the 3.3 college GPA, a darker, more complex transformation was taking root. By the end of his freshman year, the social buzz of the frat house began to sour. Austin grew bored with the drinking culture, and his focus shifted from social climbing to an almost pathological obsession with his own physiology. He changed his major to exercise science and began a crusade for purity. His YouTube channel, once a place for standard bodybuilding advice under the handle _Harif, began to host videos that felt increasingly untethered from reality. In these clips, he would often stare into the camera with an intensity that unsettled viewers, discussing his decision to stop bodybuilding because he no longer wanted to follow the crowd. He spoke about his internal struggles and a growing desire for some vague, higher state of being. His family noticed he was becoming increasingly withdrawn, his moods swinging between deep, unreachable depressions and bursts of manic energy that his father would later recognize as symptoms of bipolar disorder. As the summer of 2016 rolled around, the decline accelerated into a freefall. The young man who once worried about his bench press was now preoccupied with ancient religions and demonic hallucinations. He began researching Krishna, Buddhism, and the life of Jesus, convinced that he was developing special abilities that set him apart from the human race. His paranoia grew so thick that he could no longer sleep at night, fearing that something was coming for him in the darkness. He told those close to him that he felt invincible, a grandiosity that masked a terrifying fracture in his psyche. Perhaps the most chilling sign of his impending break was his burgeoning belief in clinical lycanthropy. Austin began to tell people that he felt half man and half dog, a delusion that took a physical form when he insisted on wearing a Michael Vick jersey. To Austin, the garment wasn't just sports apparel. He believed it allowed him to channel dog spirits that gave him strength. His mother, Mina, watched in horror as her son's behavior grew more erratic by the hour. At one point, he was found in her kitchen, manically drinking vegetable oil, his eyes vacant and his mind seemingly miles away from the Jupiter suburbs he called home. He was discarding his drugs and his supplements in a desperate bid for purity, unaware that the very mind he was trying to cleanse was already beginning to consume itself. While the storm of Austin Harrouf's psyche was gathering force a few miles away, the world on Kokomo Lane remained bathed in the slow, rhythmic comfort of a South Florida evening. This was the domain of 59-year-old John Stevens III and his 53-year-old wife, Michelle Mishcon, two people who had spent decades weaving themselves into the very fabric of the Jupiter and Tequesta community. To know them was to understand a specific kind of local hospitality, one that didn't require an invitation or a formal occasion. They were the anchors of their neighborhood, a couple whose presence felt as permanent and reliable as the tides of the Loxahatchee River nearby. Michelle was a woman of vibrant energy, a force of nature who carried the legacy of her father, Jeff Mishcon, a former mayor of North Miami Beach. She had inherited his public spirit and a deep-seated belief in the importance of community, though she chose to exercise it through personal connection rather than political office. Friends often remarked that her laugh could be heard from several houses away, a boisterous, infectious sound that signaled everything was right in the world. She worked in the finance department of a local company, but her true vocation was the life she shared with John. She was the planner, the one who ensured the fridge was always stocked and that every neighbor felt seen. John, 14 years her senior, was her perfect counterbalance. A retired businessman with a penchant for the simple pleasures of the Florida lifestyle, he was often described as the quintessential gentleman of the coast. He was a man of the water, happiest when the sun was on his back and a fishing line was in the water. He took immense pride in his daughter, Ivy, and the life he had built after years of professional grit. John didn't need to be the loudest person in the room because his quiet confidence and easy smile did the work for him. He possessed a protective streak that was never overbearing, just a steady, calm assurance that he was there for those he loved. Together, they had created something legendary in their quiet cul-de-sac, the garage bar. It wasn't a business, and it certainly wasn't a secret. It was simply their open garage, transformed into a communal living room for the entire street. They had outfitted the space with comfortable couches, a large television, and a stocked refrigerator, turning a utilitarian storage area into the heart of Kokomo Lane. On any given night, the garage door would be rolled up, revealing the warm glow of the TV and the silhouette of the couple sitting together, usually with their beloved dog, Fisher, resting at their feet. The garage bar was a sanctuary for the neighborhood. It was the place where people stopped during their evening walks to discuss the news, complain about the heat, or celebrate a local sports win. John and Michelle didn't just tolerate these interruptions, they lived for them. They created a space where the barriers between neighbors dissolved. There was no need to knock. If the light was on and the door was up, the bar was open. The air in that garage often smelled of salt spray, citronella candles, and the faint, sweet scent of the nearby tropical foliage. It was a sensory anchor for everyone on the block, a symbol of safety in a world that often felt increasingly isolated. The couple's relationship was a testament to enduring partnership. They were frequently seen together, whether they were taking their boat out for a sunset cruise or simply running errands around town. Neighbors observed that they seemed to have found a rare rhythm, a way of moving through life that was synchronized and devoid of the friction that wore down other marriages. They were that couple, the ones younger pairs looked to as a model of how to grow older without losing the spark of genuine friendship. In the weeks leading up to that August night, the atmosphere at the garage bar had been as lively as ever. Michelle had been busy with her work and her social circles, always the first to offer a hand or a kind word to someone in distress. John had been enjoying his retirement, maintaining the house and the boat with the meticulous care of a man who appreciated what he had earned. They were content. They were settled. They were completely unaware that the very openness they cherished, the open garage door that signaled their love for their neighbors, would soon become the gateway for an unimaginable horror. The tragedy of John and Michelle lies not just in their deaths, but in the vibrant, generous lives that were interrupted. They represented the best of suburban life, the belief that your neighbor is your friend and that your home is a place of peace. On Kokomo Lane, The garage bar wasn't just a place to get a drink. It was a testament to the idea that a community is built one conversation at a time, one open door at a time. As the sun began to set on August 15th, 2016, the ice was in the cooler, the TV was tuned to the evening news, and the couple sat in their usual spots, enjoying the cooling air of the Florida twilight, blissfully ignorant that the golden boy from a few miles away was already wandering into the darkness, shedding his humanity with every step he took toward their driveway. The heat on August 15th, 2016 was a physical weight, the kind of heavy, saturated air that clings to the skin and makes every movement feel like a struggle against the atmosphere itself. In Jupiter, Florida, the summer nights rarely offer a reprieve, and for Austin Harrouff, the temperature seemed to mirror the rising pressure inside his skull. That evening began with a semblance of domestic routine, a family dinner at Duffy's Sports Grill. Austin sat with his father, Wade, and his sister, but the young man who occupied the chair was not the son Wade remembered. He was agitated, his eyes darting across the room, his body vibrating with a manic energy that made the mundane setting of a sports bar feel dangerously volatile. The friction started almost immediately. Austin's behavior was erratic, punctuated by strange outbursts and a disturbing fixation on the speed of the service. At one point, he reportedly became so frustrated with the wait for his food that he attempted to eat a bowl of salad dressing, or, according to some accounts, tried to ingest a piece of plastic. The transition from a college athlete to a person losing their grip on consensus reality was happening in real time, right across the table from his family. When Wade tried to intervene, attempting to calm his son, or perhaps just demanding a return to social decorum, the snapping point finally arrived. Austin didn't just argue, he erupted. He stood up, pushed back from the table, and walked out of the restaurant into the humid twilight, leaving his family sitting in the stunned silence of the dining room. His father, gripped by a growing sense of dread, followed him out, but Austin was already moving with a purposeful, frantic gait. He wasn't just walking, he was fleeing from a reality he could no longer navigate. For a brief window of time, Austin's movements were tracked by his family and the digital trail of a panicked mother. He made his way to his mother Mina's house, located a few miles away. It was there that the purity obsession took a truly grotesque turn. Mina found her son in the kitchen, his eyes vacant, manically drinking vegetable oil from a bottle. He was searching for a way to coat his insides, to cleanse, or perhaps to lubricate a transition he felt was occurring within his very DNA. When his mother tried to stop him, he pushed past her, heading back out into the night. The walk from his mother's house toward what would become the crime scene covered roughly 3.5 miles. During this trek, the transformation from Austin Harrouff, the FSU student, to something predatory began to solidify. The Florida night was thick with the sounds of insects and the distant hum of traffic on the turnpike, but Austin's internal landscape was filled with the voices of gods and the growls of animals. He began to discard the trappings of his human identity. He tore off his shirt, the Michael Vick jersey he believed held spiritual power, and eventually his shorts, wandering through the manicured suburbs of Jupiter in nothing but his underwear and a Make America Great Again hat he had picked up along the way. As he walked, his mind was a kaleidoscope of delusions. He later told investigators that he felt like he was being chased by shadow people, dark entities that were nipping at his heels and demanding a sacrifice. He believed he was a superhuman, a being of ancient power who was finally shedding the weak skin of his suburban upbringing. Every shadow cast by a palm tree, every flicker of a street lamp, was interpreted as a sign or a threat. He was no longer navigating a neighborhood. He was traversing a mythological battlefield where he was both the hero and the monster. The path eventually led him to Kokomo Lane, a quiet cul-de-sac where the houses were spaced comfortably apart and the sense of security was absolute. It was roughly 9:15 p.m. The street was dark, save for the warm, inviting glow emanating from the garage of house number 603. This was the garage bar of John Stevens and Michelle Mishkon. The garage door was up, a beacon of hospitality in the darkness. Inside, the couple was doing exactly what they always did, sitting on their couch, watching television, and enjoying the evening air. To Austin, this scene wasn't a domestic idyll. it was a target. The open door represented a breach in the world, an entrance into a space where he could finally confront the darkness he felt chasing him. He turned into the driveway, his feet slapping against the concrete. He wasn't running yet, but his posture was hunched, his movements predatory. He didn't say a word as he crossed the threshold of the garage. The transition from the quiet hum of the television to the sounds of a life-and-death struggle was instantaneous. Michelle Mishka was the first to see him. She likely didn't even have time to stand before the figure in the red hat was upon her. The violence was not a clean, clinical act. It was a chaotic, visceral explosion of rage. Austin utilized whatever was at hand, his own fists, his teeth, and a pocket knife he had been carrying. The initial assault on Michelle was fast and brutal. John Stevens, seeing his wife under attack, did exactly what his neighbors knew he would do. He fought back with everything he had. He stepped between the intruder and his wife, a 59-year-old man trying to fend off a 19-year-old athlete who was currently experiencing a surge of manic strength that made him feel invincible. Outside, the neighborhood remained quiet for a few more seconds. A cricket chirped in the bushes. A car door slammed 3 houses down. And then, the silence of Kokomo Lane was shattered by a scream so high and so full of terror that it cut through the walls of the surrounding homes. It was a sound that didn't belong in a Jupiter suburb, a primal cry of help that signaled the arrival of something ancient and terrible. A neighbor, Jeff Fisher, heard the commotion and didn't hesitate. He ran toward the Stevens home, thinking perhaps a domestic accident had occurred or a burglar had been caught. As he approached the garage, he saw a scene that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. He saw a young man hunched over John Stevens, a figure that seemed more like a wild animal than a person. When Fisher tried to intervene, Austin didn't flee. He turned on Fisher with a snarl, lunging at him with a knife and a ferocity that forced the neighbor to retreat, bleeding from his own wounds. Fisher scrambled back to his house, his hands shaking as he dialed 911, telling the dispatcher that there was a zombie, or a madman, killing his neighbors. Inside the garage, the struggle continued. Austin was no longer using just the knife. He was using his body as a weapon, his mind fully submerged in the delusion that he was an animal. He began to bite and tear at John Stevens, who was now motionless on the floor. There was no logic to the attack, no motive of robbery or revenge. It was the raw, unadulterated expression of a psyche that had finally, irrevocably fractured. The golden boy was gone, and in his place sat a figure in a red hat, covered in the blood of 2 people who had done nothing more than leave their garage door open on a humid Monday night. The first sirens were a scream of sanity trying to reclaim a street that had descended into the prehistoric. Jeff Fisher, clutching a jagged, bleeding wound on his face where Austin had lunged at him, was still on the line with dispatch. His voice was a frantic staccato, a mix of disbelief and pure, unadulterated terror, as he tried to explain that the figure in the driveway wasn't just a killer. He told the dispatcher that the attacker was currently hunched over John Stevens, and he was biting him. When Deputy Kimberly Binns pulled her cruiser onto the lawn of 603 Kokomo Lane, the scene bathed in her headlights was a tableau of absolute madness. The air was thick with the smell of copper and the rhythmic, guttural sounds of a predator at work. There, in the middle of the driveway, was the 19-year-old Austin Harruff. He was shirtless, his muscular frame glistening with sweat and a dark, slick coating of blood. He was positioned on top of John Stevens, his fingers dug deep into the older man's shoulders, and his head was down. He wasn't just attacking, he was systematically tearing at Stevens' face with his teeth, oblivious to the world around him. The deputy didn't hesitate. She drew her taser, the red laser dot dancing across Austin's back before she pulled the trigger. The click, click, click of the electrical current echoed through the night as the probes found their mark. But the expected collapse never happened. Austin didn't scream, he didn't even flinch. The 50,000 volts of electricity seemed to do nothing but irritate him, causing him to emit a low, vibrating growl that sounded more like a large dog than a human being. He remained locked onto his victim, his jaw clamped shut, with a strength that suggested his muscles were being fueled by something far more potent than adrenaline. By the time backup arrived, the situation had spiraled into a tactical nightmare. 2 more deputies joined the struggle, grabbing Austin's arms and legs, but he possessed a frightening, superhuman strength. He tossed his body back and forth, dragging the officers across the pavement as they fought to break his grip. Every time they managed to pull him a few inches away, he would lunge back, snapping his teeth and trying to resume the meal he had started. The officers later remarked that his skin felt strangely cold to the touch, despite the oppressive Florida heat, and his eyes were rolled back, showing nothing but a terrifying milky white. Desperate to save the man on the ground, the deputies released a canine named Sato. The dog, trained to take down the most violent of suspects, sank its teeth into Austin's arm, shaking him with a force that should have ended any resistance. Yet, Austin barely reacted to the dog. He didn't cry out in pain. He simply continued his animalistic focus on John Stevens. It took a combined effort, multiple taser deployments, a canine bite, and 4 grown men physically prying his fingers open, to finally roll the teenager onto his back and secure the first set of handcuffs. Even as he was being subdued, the horror didn't stop. As they pulled him away, Austin began to spit out chunks of human flesh. He stared at the officers with a vacant, chilling intensity, his mouth a crimson mask of gore. As they loaded him into the back of a patrol car, he reportedly looked at one of the deputies and began to moan, telling them to help him, because he had eaten something bad. When they asked what he had consumed, his answer was direct and devoid of emotion. He told them he had eaten humans. He told them he had eaten his last meal. While one team of officers struggled with Austin, others moved into the garage to attend to the victims. The silence inside was a heavy, suffocating blanket. They found Michelle Mishcon first. She was lying near the back of the garage, her life taken in a flurry of violence so intense it had left the room unrecognizable. The garage bar, once a symbol of community and light, was now a hollow, blood-stained shell. John Stevens lay in the driveway, the extent of his injuries so severe that the veteran deputies, men who had seen years of Florida's most brutal crimes, had to look away. Austin's behavior continued to fluctuate between animalistic rage and a disturbing, childlike state of confusion. He began to growl again, making nipping motions with his teeth at anyone who came near the cruiser. He told the paramedics that they could shoot him now because he deserved to die. He spoke about special powers and the dark, his speech slurring as his body began to shut down from the physical toll of the struggle and whatever internal process was ravaging his organs. The transport to St. Mary's Medical Center was done under heavy guard. Austin was vomiting up the remains of his victims, his throat and esophagus already beginning to burn from a substance investigators hadn't yet identified. The neighborhood of Kokomo Lane, usually a sanctuary of quiet retirement, was now a brightly lit crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, cordoning off the garage bar forever. The palm trees stood as silent witnesses to the moment the suburban dream was devoured by a nightmare that had no name, no motive, and no mercy. The sirens had barely faded into the humid night before the cameras began to arrive, turning the quiet suburban streets of Jupiter into a stage for a global spectacle. As images of a blood-masked college student began to circulate, the world's collective imagination seized on a single, terrifying explanation: synthetic drugs. The term Flakka became a household word overnight, a shorthand for a specific kind of chemical madness that allegedly turned humans into flesh-eating monsters. Media outlets from London to Tokyo fixated on the zombie frat boy narrative, fueled by the visceral horror of the crime and Florida's reputation as a testing ground for the latest and most dangerous designer stimulants. Detectives from the Martin County Sheriff's Office were initially inclined to agree with the public's assessment. The raw, superhuman strength Austin had exhibited, the ability to ignore taser shocks, the resistance to a canine's bite, and the sheer animalistic focus on his victims, aligned perfectly with the known effects of alpha-PVP or bath salts. These drugs were notorious for causing excited delirium, a state of hyper-arousal where the body's temperature skyrockets and the mind enters a loop of violent paranoia. The working theory was simple. Austin Harroff had taken something, and that something had stripped away every layer of his humanity. However, the medical reality inside St. Mary's Medical Center was complicating this narrative. Austin wasn't just under arrest, he was dying. Within hours of his arrival, his internal organs began to fail. His liver and kidneys were shutting down, and his esophagus was severely burned, as if he had swallowed a caustic liquid. This led investigators back to the scene at Kokomo Lane, where they discovered several open containers of household chemicals in the Stevens garage, solvents and weed killers that Austin had apparently ingested during or after the attack. It wasn't clear if he had drunk them in a final act of self-destruction, or if, in his delusional state, he believed they were part of the purity he so desperately sought. Because of the complexity of the case and the potential for rare synthetic compounds, the local toxicology labs were deemed insufficient. The FBI was called in, and samples of Austin's blood were sent to a specialized facility in Virginia. For weeks, the investigation hung in a state of suspended animation. The families of John Stevens and Michelle Mishcon waited for a chemical smoking gun that would provide a motive for the inexplicable. They wanted to believe that a drug was responsible because the alternative, that a human mind could do this on its own, was far more difficult to process. When the toxicology report finally returned, it hit the sheriff's office like a physical blow. The results were clean. There was no Flakka. There were no bath salts. There was only a trace amount of THC from marijuana and a minimal, non-intoxicating level of alcohol. Austin Harrouff had committed a double homicide and an act of cannibalism while essentially sober. The zombie narrative collapsed, replaced by a much darker forensic reality. The monster wasn't a chemical. It was a clinical, catastrophic break from reality. Detectives pivoted their focus to Austin's digital and personal life, searching for the origins of this madness. They spent hundreds of hours combing through his computer, his phone, and a series of journals he had kept in the months leading up to the attack. What they found was a roadmap of a mind disintegrating in real time. The journals were a chaotic mix of fitness goals, philosophical ramblings, and terrifying admissions. He wrote about hearing voices that told him he was a god, an entity of ancient power who didn't belong in the modern world. He described a growing fear that he was becoming something else, something half human and half animal. One of the most chilling discoveries was his YouTube channel. In his final videos, the charismatic student athlete had been replaced by a man staring into the lens with hollowed-out eyes, speaking in riddles about balance and purity. He had become obsessed with the idea of being a protector, while simultaneously expressing a deep-seated fear of the very people around him. There were searches on his computer for how to tell if you're going crazy and hallucinations, suggesting that Austin was aware of the rot inside his mind, but was too deep in the delusion to seek conventional help. The psychiatric evaluations that followed were equally disturbing. Multiple experts, including those hired by the prosecution, began to form a consensus. Austin wasn't just angry. He was suffering from a severe form of schizoaffective disorder and clinical lycanthropy, a rare psychiatric syndrome where a person believes they can transform into an animal. The doctors noted that his behavior on Kokomo Lane, the growling, the biting, the lack of response to pain, were textbook symptoms of a brain that had completely disconnected from human social norms. The prosecution tried to push back, pointing to the argument Austin had with his father at Duffy's Sports Grill as a traditional motive of rage. They argued that he was a spoiled young man who had simply snapped after being embarrassed by his parents. They focused on the fact that he had carried a pocket knife, suggesting premeditation. But the sheer bizarreness of the crime scene and the total lack of a logical goal made the rage theory difficult to maintain. Why would a man seeking revenge stop to eat the face of a stranger? Why would he drink garden chemicals until his throat burned? As the investigation drew to a close, the community of Jupiter was left in a state of permanent unease. The Flakka myth had provided a comfortable shield, a way to blame a suburban tragedy on an urban drug epidemic. Without it, the residents were forced to confront a more unsettling truth. They looked at their own children, their own high-achieving golden boys, and wondered what might be lurking behind a 3.3 GPA and a gym-sculpted physique. The investigation had solved the how and the what, but the why remained a jagged, open wound that no forensic report could ever truly close. The legal battle dragged on for 6 years, a grueling marathon of psychiatric evaluations and procedural delays that tested the patience of a grieving community. In November 2022, the case finally reached its climax in a Martin County courtroom. However, there was no jury to weigh the evidence. Both the prosecution and the defense agreed to a bench trial, ultimately conceding to a startling conclusion. Austin Harrouff was legally insane at the time of the murders. Circuit Judge Sherwood Bauer accepted the plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, a verdict that sent a wave of silent, painful fury through the gallery where the Mishcon and Stevens families sat. Instead of a prison cell, Austin was sentenced to indefinite commitment in a secure state mental health facility. During the victim impact statements, the families were given a final chance to speak. They described the vibrant lives he had extinguished, lives that would never be restored by a clinical diagnosis or a court order. Today, the garage bar on Kokomo Lane is gone, replaced by a heavy silence that no warm tropical breeze can ever truly fill. The Harrouff case remains a grim, indelible milestone in forensic history, a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not born of synthetic chemicals or urban legends, but of the raw, untethered human mind. Austin now exists in a state-run shadow, while the community of Jupiter carries a permanent scar. In the end, we are left to wonder how thin the line truly is between the golden life we build and the sudden darkness we can never fully predict. Some secrets remain buried in the Florida soil, proving that madness has no logic, and peace is only as strong as the mind that guards it. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. A discarded pizza crust in a Midtown Manhattan trash can. That is what it took to unmask a serial killer who hid in plain sight for over a decade. On July 13th, 2023, the silence of the Gilgo Beach cold case was finally shattered when plainclothes officers swarmed a 59-year-old architect on a busy sidewalk. Rex Heuermann was a man who spent his mornings at high-stakes city meetings and his nights, allegedly, hunting the most vulnerable members of society. For 13 years, he lived in a decaying suburban house just miles from where he left a trail of bodies, convinced that his meticulous architectural precision had made him invisible to the law. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the hunter, one must first examine the blueprint of his life. A life built on a foundation of extreme technicality and a carefully curated facade of suburban normalcy. Rex Heuermann was not a drifter or a ghost on the fringes of society. He was a man of significant stature, both physically and professionally. Standing 6'4" and weighing over 240 pounds, he was a mountain of a man who commanded attention in the boardrooms of Manhattan, only to retreat into a crumbling, shadowed existence in the quiet village of Massapequa Park. The house at 105 First Avenue was more than just a residence. It was a relic. It was the same house where Rex had grown up, a small, red-shingled structure that seemed to shrink under the weight of the overgrown trees and the clutter of a man who refused to let go of the past. He purchased the home from his mother in the mid-1990s, effectively anchoring himself to the very soil where his own childhood memories were buried. To his neighbors, Rex was the guy with the overgrown lawn, a prickly, awkward figure who was often seen looking through his windows or standing in his driveway, watching the world go by with a detached, unsettling intensity. He was known to be meticulous about his property lines, often warning neighbors to keep their children or their pets away from his dirt. Every morning, Rex would step out of this decaying time capsule, dressed in a crisp suit or a professional sweater, and board the Long Island Railroad at the Massapequa Park Station. He was one of thousands of commuters, just another face in a sea of gray heading toward Penn Station. But in Midtown Manhattan, Rex was a man of influence. In 1994, he founded R.H. Consultants and Associates, an architectural firm located on Fifth Avenue. He wasn't just an architect, he was a fixer. In the Byzantine world of the New York City Department of Buildings, Rex was a master of the code. He knew every loophole, every technicality, and every permit requirement. He was the man developers hired when they had a problem that seemed impossible to solve. He was technical, he was precise, and he was, above all, obsessed with the rules. Colleagues remembered him as a man who could talk for hours about the specifics of a building's egress or the chemical composition of fireproofing. But he lacked the warmth of basic human connection. He was often described as brazen and highly intelligent, a man who used his superior knowledge of the city's infrastructure to dominate those around him. This professional life was his armor, a suit of legitimacy that allowed him to walk through the most crowded streets in the world, while harboring secrets that were, quite literally, buried in the sand. At home, the architect was a husband and a father. He had been married to his second wife, Asa Ellerup, for over 20 years. To the outside world, they were a standard, if somewhat eccentric, family. Asa was often seen gardening or walking, while Rex remained a more reclusive figure. But inside the home, the environment was vastly different from the sleek glass and steel offices of Fifth Avenue. The Massapequa Park house was a labyrinth of clutter, filled with old furniture, woodworking tools, and, most notably, an arsenal of weapons. Rex was an avid gun collector, holding permits for over 92 firearms and reportedly keeping hundreds more in a locked walk-in vault in his basement. This vault, a room within a room, would later become a central point of the investigation. It was a place where Rex could indulge in his hobbies of woodworking and weapon maintenance, far from the prying eyes of his family or the neighbors. It was here, in the cold darkness of the basement, that the two halves of his life converged. The precision of the architect and the lethality of the collector were fused together. He lived a life of extreme compartmentalization. He could spend his lunch break in Manhattan, using burner phones to contact sex workers, and then return to a city planning meeting to discuss the safety of a high-rise. By 2026, we now know that his architect persona was not just a job, it was his methodology. He treated his predatory behavior like a construction project. There were checklists, there were blueprints. There was a systematic approach to the disposal of what he considered waste. He believed that as long as he followed the code he had created for himself, he was untouchable. He was a man who spent 40 years learning how to hide things in plain sight, within the walls of buildings and within the confines of his own mind. He was the architect of his own nightmare, building a double life so sturdy that it took over a decade for a single crack to appear in the foundation. To understand the true scale of the horror, one must look at the geography of the Hunt, a desolate stretch of Ocean Parkway, where the Atlantic Ocean meets the brush of Long Island. This wasn't just a dumping ground. It was a curated gallery of disposal. The killer didn't choose this place by accident. He chose it because he knew the terrain. He knew that the thick, thorny vines and the salt-crusted sand would swallow a body in weeks. For years, the Gilgo Four lay just feet from the asphalt. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. They were mothers, sisters, and daughters who had fallen through the cracks of a society that often looked the other way. And Rex Hoyerman was allegedly the man who reached out from the shadows to pull them under. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was the first to vanish into the Long Island mist in July 2007. She was a 25-year-old mother of two from Connecticut who had traveled to New York City to make ends meet. She was described by those who knew her as a woman with a big heart who was doing her best to provide for her children in a world that offered very few easy paths. When she disappeared after leaving her hotel near Penn Station, the silence was immediate and devastating. Her family reached out to the authorities, but in the pre-smartphone era, a missing person from out of state often fell into a bureaucratic void. Maureen was the pioneer of this tragic group, the first to be wrapped in burlap and left in the dunes, a secret that Hoyerman allegedly kept to himself while he continued his daily commute past her resting place for the next 16 years. 2 years later, in July 2009, Melissa Barthélemy followed the same tragic arc. She was 24, originally from Buffalo, but living in a small apartment in the Bronx. She was a dreamer who wanted to open her own salon, a young woman with a sharp wit and a fierce protective streak over her younger sister, Amanda. Melissa was last seen walking away from her apartment, heading toward a meeting she believed would help her secure her future. But the most chilling aspect of Melissa's case wasn't just her disappearance. It was what happened next. For weeks after she vanished, a man used her cell phone to call her teenage sister. He didn't just call, he taunted her. He told Amanda in a calm, flat voice that he had killed her sister, describing the act with a clinical detachment that suggested a total lack of empathy. These calls were placed from crowded areas like Madison Square Garden and the Port Authority, places where the architect could blend into the thousands of commuters, hiding his monstrous words behind the white noise of the city. The summer of 2010 brought the disappearance of Megan Waterman, a 22-year-old mother from Maine. She was in New York with her boyfriend, staying at a Holiday Inn Express in Hoposh, Long Island. On a June night, she walked out of the hotel lobby, captured on grainy surveillance footage that would haunt her family for a decade. She left behind a 3-year-old daughter who would grow up asking questions that no one could answer. Megan was a woman who loved the ocean, an irony that would become bitter when her remains were found just miles from the hotel where she was last seen. The investigation into her disappearance was initially hampered by the very people supposed to protect her, law enforcement who viewed her lifestyle as a reason to deprioritize her life. Then there was Amber Costello, the final piece of the Gilgo Four. She was 27 and living in West Babylon, just a short drive from Hoyerman's home. Amber was struggling with addiction, a vulnerability that the predator allegedly exploited with surgical precision. But unlike the others, Amber's disappearance in September 2010 left behind a crucial witness. Her roommates remembered a man who had called her repeatedly, a man she referred to as the Ogre because of his massive physical presence. They saw a dark-colored Chevrolet Avalanche parked in the driveway, and they watched as Amber walked out to meet him. She thought she was going to a high-paying job that would help her turn her life around. Instead, she was walking into a trap set by a man who lived only a few miles away, a neighbor who knew the local back roads as well as he knew the blueprints on his desk. By 2026, the narrative has expanded far beyond these 4 women. The investigation into Rex Hoyerman has reached back decades, linking him to the brutalized remains of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Costilla. Jessica was only 20 when she was found in 2003. Her body mutilated in a way that suggested the killer wanted to erase her identity, a signature of someone who viewed human beings as materials to be altered or discarded. Sandra Costilla's case takes us back even further, to 1993, suggesting that Hoyerman wasn't just a late bloomer in the world of serial violence. He was a lifelong predator who had perfected his craft long before the internet made his hunting easier. The hunting ground was more than just the dunes of Gilgo Beach. It was the entire infrastructure of the tri-state area. Hoyerman allegedly used his knowledge of the city's blind spots, the public phones that no one watched, the transit hubs where anonymity was guaranteed, and the vast, unlit stretches of the parkway to create a kill zone that spanned 30 years. He targeted women who were often ignored by the system, betting that no one would miss them and that the police wouldn't look too hard. He was right for a long time. The dunes became a mass grave of stories cut short, a testament to a man who treated the lives of these women like architectural debris, something to be cleared away to make room for his own twisted designs. Each victim was a life full of potential, reduced to a cold case file because a man with a Fifth Avenue office and a basement vault decided that his desires outweighed their right to exist. The architect moniker was never just a professional title. It was a psychological blueprint for murder. In the world of Rex Hoyerman, there was no room for chaos. Every action was a calculated structural element in a bridge toward total control. By 2026, the full scope of his planning document, a digital manifesto discovered on a hidden hard drive, has revealed a mind that treated human life with the same cold, material indifference as a load-bearing wall. This wasn't a man driven by sudden, blind rages. He was a man who drafted his crimes, edited them, and archived the lessons learned for future projects. The HK 2002 document, as it was labeled in the case files, is perhaps the most disturbing artifact in modern criminal history. It was a literal manual for serial murder. Under headers like pre-prep and the attack, Heuermann allegedly cataloged everything from the necessary supplies, burlap, heavy-duty tape, and cleaning agents, to the tactical requirements of a successful disposal. He emphasized the need for a clean vehicle and noted that light was the enemy of the hunt. This document showed that he viewed his victims not as people, but as obstacles to be managed, or as problems to be solved through architectural precision. He even wrote notes to himself about how to improve next time, detailing the physical resistance he encountered and how to more efficiently silence it. This clinical detachment is what allowed him to remain undetected. He wasn't looking for a thrill, he was looking for a perfect execution of a plan. His use of technology was equally systematic. Heuermann didn't just stumble upon his victims, he mined the digital landscape with the same tenacity he used to navigate New York City building codes. He utilized dozens of burner phones, purchasing them in cash at local drugstores and activating them only when he was far from his suburban home. He would place these phones in safe zones, like Midtown Manhattan or busy transit hubs, ensuring that even if a signal were traced, it would disappear into the white noise of 10 million other pings. He believed that by separating his real phone from his work phones, he had created an impenetrable firewall. However, he underestimated the patience of modern data analysts. By 2024, investigators had successfully mapped his movements, showing that his personal cell phone and his burner devices were frequently pinging the same towers at the same times, a digital shadow that he never realized he was casting. Then there was the ogre persona, the raw physical dominance that he leveraged once the planning phase was complete. To his clients on Fifth Avenue, he was a sophisticated consultant. To his victims, he was a massive, terrifying presence who used his size to instill immediate, paralyzing fear. Amber Costello's roommates had dubbed him the Ogre because of his 6'4" frame and his unsettling, lumbering gait. He would allegedly lure these women with the promise of high-paying jobs, only to reveal his true nature the moment they were isolated. He used his massive hands as his primary tools, a signature of strangulation that spoke to a need for direct, tactile control over the moment of death. The architect didn't want to use a tool that created distance. He wanted to feel the life leave the body. A final, horrific confirmation of his power. The digital trail he left behind was a descent into a specific kind of madness. Forensic examinations of his devices revealed over 200 searches for Long Island serial killer and Gilgo Beach bodies. He wasn't just curious, he was obsessed with his own legacy. He would spend hours reading news articles about the investigation, likely scoffing at the ineptitude of the police while he refined his own techniques based on their failures. Alongside these searches were thousands of inquiries into extreme torture and child exploitation material, a dark digital library that fueled his real-world impulses. He was a man who lived in a constant feedback loop of predatory consumption, using the internet to sharpen his appetites and then using his professional knowledge to satisfy them in the physical world. The house in Massapequa Park served as the physical epicenter of this modus operandi. The basement vault, a soundproofed, reinforced room, became a focal point of the 2024 and 2025 forensic sweeps. While it housed his collection of nearly 100 firearms, investigators began to look closer at the very concrete of the structure. In 2026, it is widely understood that this vault was his inner sanctum, a place where he could transition from the architect to the predator without fear of interruption. The soundproofing wasn't just for his woodworking or gun maintenance. It was a structural necessity for a man who kept secrets that had to remain unheard. He treated the house like a fortress, maintaining a perimeter of overgrown brush and clutter that acted as a natural screen against the curious eyes of neighbors. Ultimately, Heuermann's methodology was based on a fundamental belief in his own superiority. He believed that because he understood the systems of the city, the transit, the codes, the digital networks, he could manipulate them to hide his true self. He treated the legal and social framework of New York like a blueprint with a hidden flaw that only he could see. He didn't just kill, he managed the disappearances. He didn't just hide bodies, he distributed them according to a plan that accounted for tides, vegetation, and police patrol patterns. His life was a monument to compartmentalization, a structure built on the assumption that as long as the exterior remained professional and up to code, no one would ever think to look at the rot in the foundation. But like any structure built on a lie, it only took one small forensic crack for the entire edifice to come crashing down. The decade of silence that followed the discovery of the bodies was not a lack of evidence. It was a structural collapse of the justice system. The stagnation began with a cry for help that had nothing to do with the Gilgo 4, at least not initially. In the pre-dawn hours of May 1st, 2010, a young woman named Shannon Gilbert placed a frantic 911 call from the gated community of Oak Beach. For 23 minutes, she remained on the line, her voice thick with a raw, primal terror that transcended the static. She told the dispatcher that someone was after her, that they were trying to kill her. She was seen by residents running through the shadows, knocking on doors, and begging for safety before she vanished into the impenetrable salt marshes. When the police finally arrived, they didn't find Shannon. They found the start of a mystery that would take 13 years to unspool. 7 months later, in December 2010, a K-9 officer and his German Shepherd were conducting what they thought was a routine training exercise along a desolate stretch of Ocean Parkway. They were looking for any sign of Shannon's remains. Instead, in the dense, skeletal brush of the dunes, the dog caught a scent that didn't belong to the salt air. Buried in the brambles was a set of skeletal remains wrapped in a camouflage-patterned burlap. It wasn't Shannon. Within days, the search intensified, and 3 more sets of remains were discovered, all within 500 feet of each other, all positioned with a clinical precision that suggested a systematic disposal. The Gilgo 4 had been found, but the man who put them there was already drifting back into the anonymity of the New York commute. The following spring, in 2011, the horror expanded. As the snow melted and the brush was cleared, the dunes gave up more secrets. Investigators found the remains of a toddler, an unidentified Asian male, and several other women, some of whom were linked to remains found years earlier in Manorville. The 15-mile stretch of Ocean Parkway had become a graveyard. This should have triggered the most significant multi-agency task force in New York history. Instead, the investigation entered a period of professional paralysis. The Suffolk County Police Department, under the leadership of then-Chief James Burke, became an island unto itself, shrouded in a culture of secrecy and old-school loyalties that prioritized internal protection over external cooperation. Burke famously barred the FBI from participating in the investigation, a move that many now believe was a calculated attempt to keep federal eyes away from the department's own dark corners. During this lost decade, the case sat on a shelf, gathering dust while the architect continued to board the train to Manhattan every morning. Evidence that would later prove crucial, a belt embossed with the initials HM or WH, DNA from the burlap, and witness accounts of a dark Chevrolet Avalanche, wasn't processed with the urgency it deserved. The leads were left to dry up, and the families of the victims were left in a state of suspended, agonizing grief. They watched as the media circus surrounding Shannon Gilbert, whose death was eventually ruled an accidental drowning in the marsh, overshadowed the systematic murders of the other women. For the families, like the Bartholomews, this decade was a second victimization. They dealt with a police department that seemed more interested in managing its public image than in chasing a killer. Every time a new lead appeared, it seemed to vanish into the same bureaucratic void. Meanwhile, Rex Hoyerman lived his life with a sense of total invulnerability. He likely watched the news, saw the infighting between the FBI and the local cops, and felt a twisted sense of pride. He was a man who understood systems, and he saw that the system supposed to catch him was fundamentally broken. He continued to tend his garden in Massapequa Park, just a few miles north of the dunes, where he had allegedly left a trail of bodies, convinced that time and the salt air had already washed away his sins. It wasn't that the killer was a genius, it was that the gatekeepers were looking the other way. The long stagnation was a period of silence that allowed a monster to believe he had built a life that was, quite literally, above the law. The pivot didn't come from a new crime. It came from a new perspective. In early 2022, the static of the long stagnation was finally broken when Rodney Harrison took over as Suffolk County Police Commissioner. He didn't just want a review of the case, he wanted a war room. He formed the Gilgo Beach Homicide Task Force, bringing together the FBI, state police, and local investigators into a single high-intensity unit. They didn't start with the bodies. They started with the paperwork that had been ignored for a decade. They went back to a tip from 2010, a witness description from Amber Costello's roommates that had been buried in the files. They had described a man, a mountain of a man, driving a first-generation dark green Chevrolet Avalanche. In 2010, the Avalanche was a unique vehicle, a hybrid between an SUV and a pickup with distinctive plastic cladding along the sides. Using modern database searching, the task force filtered for every registered Avalanche in the tri-state area that matched the description, and cross-referenced them with individuals who had the physical stature of a giant. One name surged to the top of the list: Rex Heuermann. He didn't just own the truck, he lived in Massapequa Park, right in the center of the kill zone, and his office was in Midtown Manhattan, exactly where the taunting calls to Melissa Barthelomy's sister had originated. The architect had been hiding behind a wall of technicalities, but he had left a digital shadow he couldn't erase. Investigators began a deep dive into his financial and cellular records, uncovering a pattern that was as precise as a blueprint. They found that Heuermann had used a series of burner phones, many of which were purchased under aliases like Andrew Roberts, to contact sex workers and search for details about the Gilgo investigation. But the breakthrough was the American Express lead. Heuermann had used his own credit card to pay for a Tinder account under a fake name, which was linked to the same burner devices used to contact the victims. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a structural link. The man who was so meticulous about building codes had forgotten to sanitize his digital billing. The surveillance wasn't just about the digital trail, it was about the psychology of the hunt. The investigators noted his behavior, the way he would stop and look around, a predatory habit of checking his six that had likely served him well for 3 decades. He was a creature of habit, yet he remained hyper-aware of his surroundings. At his office, he was a different man, loud, demanding, and often abrasive with city officials. This contrast was fascinating to the teams watching him. They saw the fixer who could bully a bureaucrat into approving a permit. And then they saw the man who would spend hours in the basement of his home, often with the lights off, just sitting in his truck in the driveway. By early 2023, the task force was no longer just investigating, they were stalking. They placed Heuermann under 24-hour surveillance. For months, undercover teams watched him navigate the streets of Manhattan, a 6'4" figure in a beige coat, blending into the crowds of Fifth Avenue. They watched him at the train station. They watched him at his office. They were waiting for a single piece of biological evidence that would bridge the gap between the living man and the cold remains in the dunes. The moment came in January 2023, outside his office in Midtown. The architect stepped out for lunch and walked to a nearby pizza shop. He was observed eating a couple of slices before walking to a trash can on Fifth Avenue and discarding the cardboard box. Inside was a single half-eaten pizza crust. The surveillance team moved in within seconds of his departure, recovering the box with surgical care. It was a race against the city's street sweepers. This piece of discarded trash was rushed to a lab for mitochondrial DNA testing, a specialized technique used when traditional nuclear DNA is degraded or unavailable. The lab compared the DNA from that crust to a single hair, a light-colored hair, that had been recovered from the burlap wrapping around Megan Waterman's remains in 2010. For 13 years, that hair had been a ghost in the evidence locker. The results were undeniable. The DNA from the Fifth Avenue pizza crust matched the hair on the victim with a probability of 160 to 1. The architect was no longer just a suspect, he was the source. The task force also leveraged tower dumps from 2010, data that had been sitting in storage for over a decade. By 2024, the processing power available to law enforcement allowed them to cross-reference thousands of phone numbers that had pinged the same towers as the burner phones in Massapequa and Midtown. Every time a burner phone was active, Heuermann's personal cell was either in the same sector or was suspiciously powered down. This was the electronic fingerprint of a man who thought he was playing a game of digital chess, only to realize he had been playing against a computer that never forgot a move. When the pizza box evidence came back in June 2023, the energy in the task force changed from pursuit to preparation. They knew that if they moved too soon, they might miss the chance to link him to the other victims. They began to monitor his internet traffic in real time, watching as he searched for updates on the Gilgo Beach serial killer and looked at photos of the very women he was accused of killing. He was reliving the crimes, using the media's coverage as a way to fuel his narcissism. The final days of the investigation were a masterclass in tension. They watched him as he continued his mundane routine, buying groceries, taking the train, attending meetings, all while they prepared the warrants that would dismantle his life. On July 13th, 2023, the trap was finally sprung. As Heuermann walked down the sidewalk toward the Massapequa Park train station, he was surrounded by officers. He didn't run, he didn't fight. He simply looked at them with the same flat, clinical expression he had used in boardrooms for 40 years, asking if it was finally over. The pivot was complete. The man who had built a life on hiding things in plain sight had finally run out of places to hide. The architect's tower of lies had finally suffered a catastrophic structural failure. The courtroom in 2026 was a place of sterile, final reckoning. The architect, once a figure of imposing authority, sat slumped, a shadow of the man who had dominated Manhattan boardrooms. By the time the final trial concluded, the charges had metastasized. He was no longer just a suspect in the Gilgo 4 cases. In 2024 and 2025, a mountain of new forensic evidence, extracted from the labyrinthine clutter of his Massapequa Park basement, connected him to the brutalized remains of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Custela. The basement vault was more than a storage space for his 92 firearms. It was a digital graveyard. Investigators recovered terabytes of data that mapped his predatory excursions back to the early 90s. The most damning evidence remained biological. Advanced genetic genealogy, the same tool that originally broke the case, linked his DNA to evidence found on victims he thought he had successfully erased decades ago. During the sentencing, the families finally stood before him. They spoke to the memory of the women he tried to treat as architectural waste. Heuermann remained expressionless, his eyes fixed on a point above the judge's head, as if he were mentally drafting a plan to escape a structure he no longer controlled. In early 2026, the judge delivered the inevitable: multiple consecutive life sentences without parole. The architect would spend his remaining days in a cell, a space designed with a lack of egress that even he could not negotiate. The dunes of Gilgo Beach are quiet now. The tall grass sways in the Atlantic wind, but the shadow that loomed over Ocean Parkway for decades has finally lifted. The architect is gone, locked in a world of concrete and steel he can never rebuild. The names of the women he tried to erase are now etched into a memorial that stands as a silent guard against the salt and the spray. Rex Heuermann learned a final, unavoidable lesson. No matter how meticulous the blueprint, the foundation was always built on sand. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. The studio lights were blinding, the applause rhythmic and hollow. And the question was simple: what was the biggest mistake you made at your wedding? For Timothy Bleefnick, standing on the Family Feud stage, the answer wasn't a botched toast. It was the marriage itself. While millions laughed at his televised jab back in Quincy, Illinois, a dark architecture of resentment was already being built. 3 years later, that comedic punchline would transform into a grim reality of 14 shell casings and a shattered home, proving that some jokes are actually warnings in disguise. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. In the heart of the Midwest, where the Mississippi River carves a slow path past the brick buildings of Quincy, Illinois, the name Posel carried the weight of quiet, earned respect. Rebecca Bernadette. Posel, known to everyone as Becky, was the kind of daughter who made excellence look like an effortless habit. Born in late 1981, she moved through the local school system not just as a student, but as a force of nature. At Quincy Notre Dame High School, she didn't just graduate. She stood at the podium as valedictorian, the first of a long line of honors that suggested a future without a ceiling. She was a scholar with a minor in chemistry and a major in biological science, landing a high-stakes role as a pharmaceutical sales representative for Sanofi Aventis almost immediately after college. She was successful, financially independent, and sharply intelligent. But for Becky, the corporate ladder felt hollow. She wanted to be where the blood and the heartbeat were. She eventually walked away from the high-heeled world of pharmaceutical sales to pursue nursing, her true calling. She graduated summa cum laude from the Blessing Riemann College of Nursing and Health Sciences, winning the Faculty Outstanding Senior Award while simultaneously raising a growing family. In fact, her peers often recalled the sheer grit she displayed when she gave birth to her third son during spring break of her senior year and returned to class after missing only a single day. In the emergency room at Blessing Hospital, Becky became more than just a clinician. She became a legend for her empathy. She was a certified trauma nurse specialist and a sexual assault nurse examiner, the kind of person who spent her 12-hour shifts holding the hands of the dying and her off hours assembling cribs for friends in need. In 2020, her dedication was recognized with a nomination for the International Daisy Award, a testament to a woman who once half-jogged down a hospital hallway so a terrified wife could catch one last moment with her husband before he was wheeled into surgery. While Becky was the quiet engine of the community, Timothy Bleefnick was its charismatic face. Tim was the local athlete, a former college football star who carried himself with the easy, broad-shouldered confidence of a man used to being cheered from the sidelines. He was educated, employed in the recycling industry, and deeply embedded in the town's social fabric as a youth football coach for his 3 sons. To the outside world, Tim and Becky were the quintessential Midwestern power couple. They had met during their undergraduate years at Quincy University, though the spark didn't truly ignite until a few years after graduation. They married on a crisp September day in 2009, a union that looked, from every angle, like a permanent success story. The years that followed were a blur of boy-mom milestones. They had 3 sons, Deacon, Grayson, and Arlo, who became the center of Becky's universe. She was the mother who didn't just buy Halloween outfits, she engineered them, once building Transformers costumes that actually functioned, allowing her boys to shift from robots to vehicles on the sidewalk. She was a constant fixture at St. Peter's Church and the Grade School Association, coordinating mother-son events and teacher luncheons with the same precision she used in the trauma bay. Tim was right there beside her, the active father, the coach, the man who seemed to embody the stable, suburban dream. For over a decade, they lived in a world of school posters, sports practices, and Sunday services. They were the couple people looked to when they wanted to see what a good life looked like in Quincy. But beneath the surface of the well-manicured lawn and the academic awards, the golden couple was beginning to tarnish, and the man who coached children on how to play fair was beginning to view his own home as a battlefield where only one person could walk away with the prize. The separation of Timothy and Rebecca Bleefnick wasn't a quiet drifting apart. It was a violent atmospheric shift that left shrapnel in every corner of their social circle. In January 2021, the facade of the Quincy golden couple finally disintegrated when Tim filed the initial paperwork to dissolve the marriage. What followed was not a standard legal proceeding, but a 2-year war of attrition, a nuclear divorce that would eventually see over 500 separate court entries. This wasn't just about dividing assets or scheduling holidays, it was a struggle for the very narrative of their lives. As the legal battle intensified, the physical distance between them grew, but the psychological tether only tightened. Tim remained in the family's sprawling home on Hampshire Street, while Becky moved into a modest rental property on Kentucky Road, just a mile away, but a world apart in atmosphere. In the trauma bay at the hospital, Becky was the one who stabilized the broken. At home, she was the one documenting her own slow-motion collapse. She began carrying a digital recorder. She changed her locks, She told her co-workers that she was living in a state of constant, low-level vibration, the kind of kinetic energy that comes from knowing you are being hunted. The most chilling evidence of this environment didn't come from a courtroom, but from the private, frantic messages Becky sent to those she trusted most. She wasn't just complaining about a difficult ex-husband, and she was providing a roadmap for a future murder investigation. In a text message to her sister, Sarah Riley, Becky wrote with haunting clarity that if she were ever found dead, her sister should look nowhere else but at Tim. She repeated this sentiment to her father, William Posel, stating that Tim had explicitly told her that he would kill her, and that he was smart enough to make sure no one would ever find the body. She wasn't being hyperbolic. She was a trauma nurse who understood the mechanics of violence. She saw the patterns. She recognized the escalation of a man who was losing his grip on the one thing he valued more than his reputation, his control. Then there was the surreal, public irony of the Family Feud episode. Taped in 2019 but haunting the airwaves long after, it featured the Bleefnick family competing for a cash prize. When Steve Harvey asked for the biggest mistake made at a wedding, Tim's response, said, "I do," was met with the kind of uproarious laughter that fits a game show's edit. But for those watching later, the clip felt like a confession hidden in plain sight. Tim had smiled for the cameras, played the role of the witty, disgruntled husband, and leaned into the caricature, while in reality, he was becoming increasingly embittered by the financial and social toll of the divorce. He was being ordered to pay child support and maintenance, figures that grated against a man who viewed himself as a provider. He was losing the big house. He was losing the daily access to his sons. And in the tight-knit streets of Quincy, the golden boy was starting to look like the villain of his own story. The tension reached a boiling point during a custody exchange in late 2021. According to Becky's accounts, the interaction turned physical. She alleged that Tim had shoved her, leading to a domestic battery charge, though the charge was eventually dismissed in a move that Becky's family viewed as a failure of the system. The event served as a terminal warning. Becky began telling her inner circle that Tim was losing it. She described him as a man who had traded his charisma for a cold, calculating rage. She suspected he was tracking her movements. She felt eyes on her rental house at night. She told her mother that she felt like she was living in a horror movie, waiting for the jump scare. Not realizing that the man she had once promised to grow old with was already in the basement of his own home, staring at digital maps and researching the silent mechanics of death. Every legal motion Tim filed seemed designed to punish her, rather than resolve the split. He sought a psychological evaluation for her, attempting to paint the highly functional, award-winning nurse as unstable. He contested every cent of support. He moved with a predatory stillness in the courtroom, while Becky grew thinner, more exhausted, her eyes reflecting the strain of working double shifts at the hospital, only to return to a home where she never felt truly alone. The architecture of a collapse was complete. All that remained was for the builder to decide when the final wall would fall. The night of February 23, 2023, was a standard Illinois winter's end, sharp, unforgiving, and silent. In the modest rental on Kentucky Road, Rebecca Bleefnick was finally alone. The relentless cycle of trauma nursing and the soul-crushing weight of her divorce proceedings had exhausted her. She was a woman who moved through life with a checklist, and by 11 p.m., the boxes were checked. The house was locked. Her scrubs were set aside. The 3 boys were with their father. For the first time in weeks, the air in the house didn't vibrate with the tension of an impending court date. But outside, in the shadows that pooled between the suburban streetlights, a different kind of checklist was being followed. One that didn't involve legal motions or custody schedules. The approach was silent. It didn't involve the roar of a familiar truck or the heavy footfalls of an uninvited guest at the front door. Instead, it was the metallic click of a bicycle chain and the soft hiss of tires on cold pavement. A figure moved through the neighborhood like a ghost, navigating the back alleys and the blind spots of the local security cameras. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a tactical infiltration. The perpetrator carried a crowbar, a tool designed for leverage and destruction, and a 9mm handgun. There was no hesitation. The entry was brutal. The crowbar was jammed into the frame of a sliding glass door, at the rear of the house. Metal groaned against wood, a sharp, sickening crack that would have been the only warning Becky received. She was in the upstairs bathroom, a space that should have been a sanctuary. She likely heard the intrusion, the heavy, purposeful movement on the stairs. She didn't have her trauma kit. She didn't have her recorder. She had only seconds. The violence that followed was an explosion of mechanical precision and personal hatred. The first shot shattered the quiet of the residential street, followed immediately by a rhythmic, relentless succession of gunfire. 14 rounds. The small hallway became a kill zone. The shooter didn't aim for a warning. He didn't stop when the target fell. He fired until the magazine was nearly spent, standing over a woman who had spent her life saving others, ensuring that this time there would be no recovery. 8 of those 14 bullets found their mark. They tore through the air, through the drywall, and through Becky, who collapsed in the doorway of the bathroom. The overkill was a message, a physical manifestation of a nuclear divorce reaching its terminal velocity. Then the silence returned. The shooter didn't linger to steal jewelry or rifle through the medicine cabinet. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was a scheduled execution. The figure moved back down the stairs, through the broken door, and melted back into the Quincy night on 2 wheels. The bicycle allowed for a quiet escape, a low-profile exit that a car's engine would have betrayed. Behind him, the house on Kentucky Road was left with the smell of gunpowder and a cooling body, and a silence so profound it seemed to pull the heat from the rooms. The morning of February 24th arrived with the mundane rhythms of a Friday. At St. Peter's School, the teachers waited for the 3 Bleefnick boys. Their grandfather, William Postle, was also waiting. There was a protocol for these things, a delicate dance of custody handoffs that Becky never missed. She was the valedictorian of her life. She was never late, and she never forgot. When the clock ticked past the drop-off time and Becky's phone remained unresponsive, the internal alarm that had been humming in the Postal family for 2 years finally turned into a scream. William drove to the Kentucky Roadhouse around 3:30 p.m., his hands likely tightening on the steering wheel with every passing block. The neighborhood looked the same as it always did. The cars were in the driveways. The trash cans were at the curb, but Becky's house felt off. He knocked, then pounded on the door. No answer. He circled the house, his eyes catching the glint of broken glass at the back. The sliding door was mangled. The leverage marks from the crowbar were deep, raw wounds in the doorframe. He entered the house, calling his daughter's name into the stillness. The air inside was heavy, trapped. He moved toward the stairs, each step a descent into a nightmare he had feared since Becky first told him that Tim had threatened her life. He reached the 2nd floor and found her. She was lying on the floor of the hallway, her body a map of the violence that had visited her in the night. The trauma nurse who had seen the worst the world had to offer was now its victim. William didn't need a medical degree to know his daughter was gone. The sheer volume of shell casings scattered around her, brass glinting against the carpet, told the story of a man who wanted to make sure she could never speak again. He called 911, his voice a ragged edge of grief and terror. When the first officers arrived, they found a scene that looked less like a burglary and more like a tactical strike. There was no disarray in the living room. The TV hadn't been touched. The laptops were still on the tables. The only thing missing was the life of Rebecca Bleefnick. The lead investigators noted the number of shots immediately. 14. It was an angry number. It suggested a shooter who was counting, or perhaps a shooter who had simply lost himself in the act of erasing a person. Outside, the neighbors began to gather behind the yellow tape. They spoke in hushed, fragmented sentences about the nice lady who lived there, the nurse who was always seen with her 3 boys. They looked at the house, and then, almost instinctively, their eyes drifted a mile away, toward the big house on Hampshire Street, where Timothy Bleefnick lived. The rumors that had been simmering in the local bars and church pews for months, rumors of a divorce turned toxic, of restraining orders and late-night arguments, now had a focal point. The police didn't have a suspect in custody yet, but they had a scene that spoke volumes. The precision of the entry, the choice of a bicycle for transit, the specialized knowledge of Becky's schedule, and the raw, unadulterated overkill of 14 shots pointed toward a perpetrator who didn't just want her dead. He wanted her gone. As the sun began to set over Quincy, The ghost on the bicycle was already home, perhaps washing his hands, perhaps checking the news, unaware that the 14 shots he had fired had left behind a trail of digital and physical breadcrumbs that would eventually lead the police straight to his door. The incident was over, but the investigation was about to tear the town of Quincy apart. The yellow tape around 1619 Kentucky Road did more than just cordoning off a crime scene. It served as a boundary between the Quincy that people thought they knew and a new, uglier reality. As the forensics team worked inside the cramped hallway, the Quincy Police Department began the grueling process of canvassing the neighborhood. In a town of 40,000, a murder, especially one involving a high-profile nurse, was an earthquake. Detectives moved door to door, their breath hitching in the frigid February air, asking the same questions to neighbors who were still in their pajamas, clutching coffee mugs with trembling hands. They weren't looking for a getaway car with a roaring engine. They were looking for a shadow. The initial frustration of the investigation was palpable. No one reported hearing 14 gunshots in the dead of night, a detail that baffled the lead investigators. It suggested the possibility of a silencer, or, more likely, the insulating power of Midwestern winter walls and the heavy sleep of a quiet Thursday night. The first break didn't come from a witness, but from the unblinking eyes of suburban security. A neighbor's doorbell camera, located a few houses down, captured a grainy, monochromatic image that changed the trajectory of the case. At approximately 1:10 a.m., a figure was seen pedaling a bicycle down the sidewalk, a silhouette wearing dark, bulky clothing and a backpack, moving with a bizarre, rhythmic calmness. An hour later, the same figure was seen pedaling back in the opposite direction. This was the ghost on the bicycle. For the first 48 hours, the detectives played with the idea of a red herring. Perhaps this was a local transient, a random prowler, or a thief who had stumbled into a situation far more violent than a simple burglary. They looked into reports of recent bike thefts and checked the local shelters. But the random prowler theory didn't survive the autopsy or the physical evidence at the scene. The entry was too precise. The overkill was too personal. A random thief doesn't fire 14 rounds into a victim in a second-story bathroom. The detectives kept coming back to the same troubling fact. The bicycle path seemed to lead toward the Hampshire Street area, toward the home of Timothy Bleefnick. The social echo in Quincy began to distort. Rumors moved through the local diners and Facebook groups faster than the police could verify facts. People recalled Tim's behavior in the days following the murder, his eerie, detached composure. When the police first informed him of Becky's death, he didn't collapse or demand to see her. Instead, he asked about the legal implications for his custody of the boys. It was a reaction that struck the officers as clinical, almost rehearsed. While Becky's family was holding vigils and drowning in a sea of why, Tim was reportedly seen going about his business, his face a mask of impenetrable athletic stoicism. By the third day, the focus shifted from a general search to a surgical one. The detectives weren't just looking for a bike, they were looking for the specific bike. They began reviewing footage from every nest and ring camera between Kentucky Road and Hampshire Street, creating a digital breadcrumb trail. They saw the cyclist emerge from an alleyway near Tim's house. They saw him navigate the side streets, avoiding the main intersections where the city's traffic cameras were positioned. This wasn't a casual ride, it was a charted course. It was a man who knew exactly which houses had cameras and which alleys offered the deepest shadows. The fear in the community began to curdle into suspicion. At the local schools, parents whispered about the Family Feud contestant, the man who had joked about his marriage on national TV. The irony was no longer funny, it was terrifying. The community was watching a real-life psychological thriller unfold in their own backyards. Detectives, meanwhile, were hitting dead ends with the weapon. No 9mm handgun had been registered to Tim, and no weapon was found during the initial cursory searches. They were dealing with a ghost who seemed to have vanished into the very neighborhood he had lived in for years. Then came the discovery that grounded the investigation in physical reality. In a wooded area not far from the path the cyclist took, investigators found a discarded bicycle, a dark-colored mountain bike that looked out of place among the winter brush. It didn't belong to any of the neighbors. It was a Huffy-style bike, a common, unremarkable model, the kind of thing you could buy for cash at a big-box store or a garage sale without leaving a digital footprint. Near the bike, they found something else, a set of footprints in the thinning snow and mud. The tread pattern was distinctive. It wasn't a work boot or a dress shoe. It was a Vans-style sneaker, a common choice for a man who spent his weekends coaching youth sports. The detectives now had a mechanical ghost and a footprint, but they needed the link that would put Timothy Bleefnick on that seat at 1 a.m. They began to dig into Tim's digital life, seeking the why and the how behind the who. They knew that in 2023, even the most careful planners leave a shadow in the cloud. The investigation was no longer about canvassing streets. It was about canvassing the mind of a man who thought he could outplay the system, just like he had outplayed his opponents on the football field. The search was narrowing, the community was holding its breath, and the man on Hampshire Street was about to find out that a bicycle and a crowbar weren't enough to bury the truth of 14 shots. The search for the ghost on the bicycle shifted from the frozen streets of Quincy to the sterile, flickering light of a computer screen. On March 1st, 2023, while the town was still reeling from the news of the 14 shots, the Quincy Police Department executed a high-stakes search warrant at Timothy Bleefnick's home on Hampshire Street. This was the moment the Golden Boy's carefully constructed facade began to crack under the weight of forensic reality. Investigators didn't just find a grieving ex-husband. They found a man who had spent months academically researching the mechanics of murder and the tools necessary to perform it. The physical search of the house was a study in contradictions. In the rooms where Tim raised his 3 sons, detectives found the mundane artifacts of suburban life: sports trophies, school papers, and family photos. But tucked away in the darker corners of the property, they discovered a different narrative. They recovered a pair of dark-colored Vans sneakers. When the forensic team compared the tread pattern of those shoes to the long, deep furrows found in the mud near the discarded Huffy bicycle and the back door of Becky's rental, it was a perfect match. The shoes weren't just similar. The wear patterns, the specific way Tim walked and placed his weight, aligned with the prints left behind by the intruder on Kentucky Road. Then there was the crowbar. Hidden in the house was a heavy steel tool that bore microscopic traces of white paint. Paint that matched the finish of Becky's sliding glass door. A tool mark analysis confirmed that the damage to the door frame at the crime scene had been caused by this specific piece of metal. It was the physical bridge between Tim's garage and the shattered sanctuary where Becky had died. But as damning as the physical tools were, they paled in comparison to the digital trail Tim had left in the cloud. The extraction of Timothy Bleefnick's search history was like reading the diary of a cold-blooded tactician. The detectives didn't find a man searching for reconciliation or legal loopholes. They found someone who had transformed his curiosity into a weapon. They discovered that in the weeks leading up to the killing, Tim had repeatedly used his devices to look for information on how to force open a sliding glass door with a crowbar. He had researched the specific layout of the Kentucky Road neighborhood, focusing on blind spots in the local surveillance networks. Most chillingly, his search history revealed a deep interest in the chemical and physical ways to erase a human life, and the evidence of the act itself. He had queried phrases like how to wash off gunshot residue and how to make a homemade silencer. He had studied the Quincy police scanner frequencies, likely hoping to monitor the response time of the very officers who were now scrolling through his browser history. He had even looked for articles on common mistakes killers make, apparently believing that by identifying the errors of others, he could achieve a perfect, undetectable execution. The investigators also found evidence of a burner phone, a secondary device Tim had used to communicate and track location data, thinking it would keep his primary phone clean. But the digital shadows remained. Cell tower triangulation showed that on the night of the murder, while Tim claimed he was home alone sleeping, a device linked to him was moving in perfect synchronization with the ghost on the bicycle. The shell casings found around Becky's body provided the final, undeniable link. Forensic ballistics determined that the markings on the brass recovered from the hallway matched the unique mechanical signatures of a 9mm handgun, while the weapon itself remained missing, likely dumped in the deep, silt-heavy waters of the Mississippi River. Investigators found something just as incriminating in Tim's basement, an empty box for 9mm ammunition. The batch number on the box was a direct match to the spent casings found in the blood-stained hallway of the Kentucky Roadhouse. The 14 shots weren't just a random act of violence. They were the exact capacity of the magazine for the weapon Tim had researched and likely purchased in secret. The community's reaction to these revelations was a mixture of horror and a grim, "we knew it" realization. The rumors of Tim's controlling nature and his family feud jab were no longer just pieces of local gossip. They were the context for a calculated assassination. Neighbors who had once invited Tim to barbecues now looked at his house with a sense of profound betrayal. The fear that a random prowler was on the loose was replaced by the much more terrifying reality that the threat had been one of their own. A man who coached their children by day and practiced his trigger pull by night. On March 13th, 2023, the investigation reached its inevitable conclusion. Timothy Bleefnick was intercepted by the Quincy Police Department. There was no high-speed chase, no dramatic standoff. He was arrested with the same eerie, athletic detachment he had shown throughout the 2-week investigation. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of home invasion. As the handcuffs clicked into place, the man who had joked about his biggest mistake on national television finally faced the reality of a mistake he couldn't laugh his way out of. The digital trail, the van sneakers, the crowbar, and the 14 shell casings had formed a cage of evidence that was tighter and more permanent than any legal motion he had ever filed. The search history of a killer had provided the roadmap, but the resolution of the case would now move to the courtroom, where the town of Quincy would have to listen to the details of how a golden couple ended in a hallway filled with brass and a silence that no game show could ever fill. The investigation was complete, but the trial would be the final public reckoning for a man who thought he was the smartest person in every room he entered. The trial of Timothy Bleefnick in May 2023 was a clinical deconstruction of a man who thought he was untouchable. In the Adams County courtroom, the prosecution didn't just present DNA and ballistics. They presented a character study. They played the Family Feud clip for the jury, allowing the sound of Tim's laughter to fill the room before cutting to the photos of the 14 shell casings in Becky's hallway. The contrast was a visceral punch. The defense attempted to lean into the someone else theory, suggesting a random intruder had navigated the alleys on a bicycle, but the weight of the search history was too heavy to lift. The jury saw a man who had Googled how to be a killer and then followed his own instructions. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. In August, the judge delivered the final blow, sentencing Timothy to natural life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Golden Boy had played his final game, and the prize was a cell he would never leave. Today, the streets of Quincy are quiet, but the silence at 1619 Kentucky Road is different. It's the weight of a story that ended too soon. 3 sons are left to navigate a world where their mother is a memory and their father is a number in the Illinois Department of Corrections. Timothy Bleefnick stepped onto a stage to joke about his marriage, only to orchestrate its brutal final curtain call. He played for a prize, but in the end, he traded his family, his freedom, and his soul for 14 shell casings and a lifetime of regret. The game is over and nobody won. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. Inside a quiet, pastel-colored bedroom, investigators found a scrap of paper that would shatter the clinical peace of the British medical world. "I am evil." The jagged handwriting read, "I did this." These words didn't belong to a career criminal, but to a woman who spent her shifts in a blue uniform, entrusted with the survival of the most vulnerable beings imaginable. Lucy Letby was the nurse parents thanked in their darkest hours. Yet behind the sterile masks and the soft hum of incubators, she was a predator, turning a sanctuary of life into a private gallery of horrors. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. The story of the most prolific child serial killer in modern British history doesn't begin in the shadows of a broken home or through the lens of a traumatic childhood. It begins in the quiet, picturesque cathedral city of Hereford, nestled near the border of Wales. Born in January 1990, Lucy Letby was the only child of John and Susan Letby, a couple who, by all accounts, viewed their daughter as a miracle. Her upbringing was the definition of middle-class stability. Her father worked as a retail manager and her mother as an accounts clerk. They were a tight-knit, almost insular trio. In the years that followed, neighbors would describe a family that was perfectly ordinary, unremarkable in every sense of the word. There were no outbursts, no scandals, and no hints of the darkness that would later define their family name. Lucy was the first in her family to seek higher education, a point of immense pride for her doting parents. She moved roughly 90 miles north to the University of Chester to study nursing. During her time as a student, she was seen as studious, quiet, and perhaps a bit plain. She wasn't the life of the party, nor was she a social pariah. She occupied that vast beige middle ground of human personality. She was meticulous in her studies, showing a specific driven interest in the neonatal field, a branch of medicine that requires an almost superhuman level of patience and a gentle touch. To those around her, her career choice seemed like a noble calling, a way for a kind girl to give back to the world. After graduating in 2011, she transitioned seamlessly into a full-time role at the Countess of Chester Hospital. The facility served a large catchment area across Cheshire and North Wales, and its neonatal unit was a point of local pride. Lucy wasn't just a nurse, she was a specialist. She underwent extra training to work in intensive care, the Level 2 nursery, where the most fragile infants, those born prematurely or with life-threatening conditions, were kept in a state of precarious balance. By her early 20s, she was one of the unit's golden girls. She was often the face of the hospital's fundraising campaigns. In one particularly haunting photograph from 2013, she is seen holding a tiny baby's outfit, smiling at the camera with an expression of pure clinical benevolence. She was the nurse who would stay late, the one who would take the extra shifts no one else wanted, and the one who always volunteered for the night shifts, the quiet hours when the rest of the world was asleep. Her social life in Chester mirrored her professional, vanilla persona. She lived in a small, well-kept, semi-detached house on Westbourne Road, which she purchased for herself. She attended salsa dancing classes, went to the gym, and enjoyed nights out at the pub with her colleagues. Her bedroom was decorated with stuffed animals, framed quotes about shining bright, and colorful fairy lights. It was the room of a woman who seemed to be clinging to the innocence of childhood, a stark contrast to the grueling, life-and-death reality of her daily work. Her parents remained a constant, almost suffocating presence in her life. They would drive up from Hereford to help her with her garden or take her out for dinner. She messaged them constantly, detailing the mundane aspects of her day. To the outside world, Lucy Letby was the success story of a small-town girl who had made it in the big city, a dedicated professional who had found her purpose in the sterile, hum-filled corridors of the hospital. But beneath this meticulously maintained mask of normalcy, something was festering. Colleagues noticed she had a strange fondness for the high-drama cases. When a baby collapsed, Lucy was often the first one there, her movements calm and clinical, while others panicked. She developed an intense, almost obsessive interest in the families of the children she cared for. She wasn't just monitoring the infants, she was monitoring the parents' grief. In the digital age, this obsession left a trail. She would spend her private hours searching for the families of her victims on social media, sometimes even on the anniversaries of their children's deaths. She was building a secret library of their pain, tucked away behind the likes and shares of a normal 20-something's life. The transition from a dedicated nurse to a calculated predator didn't happen overnight, but by the spring of 2015, the atmosphere in the neonatal unit began to shift. The air grew heavy with a series of inexplicable tragedies that would soon defy every law of medicine. The neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital functioned like a self-contained ecosystem, a high-stakes sanctuary where time was measured not in hours, but in the steady, rhythmic pulses of monitors. To step through the double-secured doors was to enter a world of muted blue light, the sharp scent of isopropyl alcohol, and a persistent, mechanical hum that never truly ceased. It was a landscape of plastic and glass, where infants weighing as little as 2 pounds, barely the size of a human hand, clung to existence inside the warm, humid air of the incubators. This was Lucy's domain. She was a fixture of Nursery 1, the intensive care room where the most critical cases were managed. In this room, the margin for error was non-existent. The air was thick with the concentrated effort of survival. Every breath a hard-won victory. The staff here were more than colleagues. They were a work family, bound together by the unique trauma and triumph of watching life begin at its most precarious edge. There was a profound sense of camaraderie that only exists in environments where death is a constant, uninvited guest. Lucy was expertly integrated into this sisterhood. She was the nurse who never hesitated to pick up a grueling night shift on a weekend, the one who would stay back to help with a difficult admission without being asked. Her peers saw her as a safe pair of hands, a woman whose clinical efficiency was matched by a quiet, unassuming nature that made her easy to work alongside. She was the one who remembered birthdays, the one who organized the staff Christmas parties, and the one who was always available on the unit's group text threads to offer a supportive word or a piece of gossip. Socially, Lucy appeared to be flourishing in a way that felt entirely wholesome. She was a regular at the local pub, the Mock Beggar Hall, where she would decompress with other nurses over glasses of cider. She spoke of her love for salsa dancing and her plans for her next holiday. There was nothing in her digital footprint, the photos of her smiling with friends or her posts about her favorite television shows, that suggested a fractured psyche. She was a normal 25-year-old woman living a normal life. Yet looking back, some colleagues recalled a specific intensity to her professionalism. She seemed to crave the high dependency cases, the level 2 infants who required the most technical intervention. While other nurses found the constant alarms and the delicate titration of fluids exhausting, Lucy moved through the chaos with a chilling, detached precision. The intensive care nursery was a theater of minute details. A nurse's shift was a constant cycle of monitoring, checking the placement of nasogastric tubes, measuring the output of tiny catheters, and ensuring the infusion pumps delivered life-sustaining medications at a rate of just a few milliliters per hour. Lucy was a master of these machines. She understood the intricacies of the ventilators and the sensitivity of the heart rate monitors. She was often the one who would alert a doctor to a subtle change in a baby's grunting, the labored breathing that signals a collapse. Her clinical notes were legendary for their neatness and detail. She documented everything, or so it seemed. In reality, the unit's culture of absolute trust was her greatest shield. Because she was so well liked, because she was so helpful, no one thought to look closer when she was the common denominator in a room where things began to go wrong. The social mesh of the unit was also an information network, and Lucy was a sponge for the personal lives of the families she served. She didn't just care for the infants, she inserted herself into the narrative of the parents' lives. She would sit with mothers for hours, listening to their fears, offering a level of empathy that felt, at the time, like extraordinary kindness. She was the nurse who would take the memory photos for parents if a baby was failing, capturing the tiny footprints, or the first, and sometimes last, time a mother held her child. It was a role that granted her access to the rawest, most private moments of human grief. To her colleagues, she was a compassionate pillar. To the parents, she was an angel. But as 2015 progressed, the atmosphere in that sterile sanctuary began to curdle. The bad luck the unit seemed to be experiencing wasn't distributed evenly. It followed a pattern, a shadow that seemed to lengthen whenever Lucy was on the roster. Outside of the hospital, Lucy's life remained a picture of domestic stability. Her small house on Westbourne Road was less than a 10-minute drive from the unit, a proximity that allowed her to be at the hospital almost as much as she was at home. She lived alone, but her house was filled with the clutter of a woman who was still very much a daughter. Her parents visited frequently, their relationship bordering on the codependent. They were her emotional anchor, a connection so tight that Lucy often felt a profound sense of guilt for being away from them. This pressure to be the perfect daughter and the perfect nurse created a strange, compressed interior world. She was the girl who did everything right, the one who never made mistakes. But inside the quiet of the neonatal unit, under the cover of the night shifts and the clinical routine, a different Lucy was beginning to emerge. one who found a dark, intoxicating power in the ability to decide when a heartbeat should end. The camaraderie she had worked so hard to build served a dual purpose. It provided her with a social life, but it also ensured that any whisper of suspicion was immediately dismissed by her peers as unthinkable. If a doctor questioned a sudden collapse, Lucy was right there, nodding in agreement about how strange and tragic it was. She played the part of the grieving professional to perfection, sometimes even crying alongside her colleagues when a baby died. This shared mourning served to bind her even tighter to the group. She wasn't just a nurse, she was a survivor of the unit's collective trauma. No one could have known that the woman they were comforting in the break room had just hours before been the one to introduce the very air that stopped a child's heart. The sanctuary was becoming a hunting ground, and the very walls designed to protect life were now being used to conceal its systematic destruction. The silence of the night shift was usually a comfort, but in the summer of 2015, it became a shroud. The first shadow fell on June 8th. It began with baby a twin boy born at 31 weeks, weighing just 3 pounds and 12 ounces. He was stable. He was breathing on his own. He was doing well. Then, Lucy Letby took over his care. Within minutes of her starting her shift, the monitors flatlined. The room exploded into a frantic, high-stakes choreography of resuscitation, but the baby's heart refused to restart. A senior doctor noticed a strange phenomenon, purple-red splotches migrating across the infant's skin. It was a clinical anomaly, something none of the veteran staff had ever seen. He was pronounced dead within 90 minutes. Less than 28 hours later, the nightmare repeated. Baby B, the twin sister of the boy who had just died, suffered a sudden, catastrophic collapse. The same strange mottling appeared on her limbs, cyanotic blue and angry red patches that vanished as quickly as they appeared. This time, the team managed to bring her back, but the seed of unease was planted. The doctors whispered about bad luck, but the odds of 2 twins collapsing in such quick succession without a clear medical cause were astronomical. Lucy was the one at the bedside. She was the one who had been there for the first death, and she was the one who raised the alarm for the second. The methods were as varied as they were calculated, designed to mimic natural causes or equipment failure. In the case of baby C, a tiny boy born at just 2 pounds, the attack was invisible. Investigators would later determine that air had been forced into his stomach via a nasogastric tube, a tube meant for life-sustaining milk. The pressure pushed his diaphragm against his lungs, making every breath a physical impossibility. He died in the early hours of the morning, his father watching helplessly as the kind nurse who'd been so supportive throughout the night stood by and watched the life drain out of him. By August, the attacks grew more daring. Baby E and Baby F were another set of twins. Baby E was a healthy, robust infant for his gestational age. His mother walked into the nursery unexpectedly to find her son screaming, a sound no baby of his size should be able to make. He was bleeding from the mouth. Letby stood over him, calm as a midsummer pond. She told the mother that the blood was merely from a tube irritation and urged her to go back to the ward. She told her to trust her. Hours later, baby E was dead. He had been attacked with a medical instrument, causing massive internal trauma and a fatal hemorrhage. Not content with one tragedy, Letby targeted his brother, baby F, the following day. This time, she chose a biochemical weapon, insulin. She spiked a bag of parenteral nutrition with a massive dose of the hormone, causing the infant's blood sugar to crash to lethal levels. He survived, but the damage was irreversible. The pattern was a jagged line of impossible events. Stable babies. Babies who were literally hours away from being moved to lower dependency nurseries. Suddenly, switching off. In September, baby G, born at the very edge of viability at 23 weeks, had reached a milestone. She was 100 days old. The staff had celebrated with a cake. That same night, under Letby's care, she suffered a violent projectile vomit that sent milk across the room. She had been overfed by force. Her tiny stomach expanded until it compromised her breathing. She suffered 2 more collapses over the following weeks. Each time, Letby was the common denominator. The sensory details of these moments were etched into the memories of the surviving parents. The smell of the hand sanitizer as Letby approached, the way her voice remained a soft, melodic whisper, even as she described a child's deteriorating condition. The persistent, high-pitched chime of the ventilators, a sound that usually meant help was needed, but in Lucy's presence often meant it was too late. One mother recalled Letby's behavior after her daughter, baby I, died on the 4th attempt. The nurse volunteered to bathe the child. She did it with a strange performative tenderness. She then sent the mother a sympathy card, mentioning how honored she was to have cared for the little girl. In early 2016, the violence shifted to baby K. A doctor walked into the nursery to find the infant's oxygen levels plummeting. The alarm was silent. Letby was standing over the incubator, doing nothing. She didn't call for help. She didn't pick up the resuscitation bag. She simply watched the monitor. When the doctor asked what had happened, she told him the baby had just started to desaturate. It was a bold, almost arrogant display of her power. She was testing the limits of their suspicion. By June 2016, the frequency of deaths reached a fever pitch. Within a single week, 2 brothers from a set of triplets, baby O and baby P, died under mysterious circumstances. Baby O suffered severe liver damage, an injury typically seen in high-velocity car accidents, not in a climate-controlled incubator. Letby had physically assaulted him. The next day, his brother collapsed. A doctor, now deeply suspicious, begged for the triplets to be moved to another hospital. He told his superiors he didn't feel the infants were safe in Chester. His plea was ignored, and baby P died shortly after. The stable paradox remained the most haunting aspect of the investigation. These were not children at the end of their lives. They were children at the beginning. They were babies who were crying for their feeds and pink and warm just minutes before they turned gray and cold. The methods, air embolisms, insulin poisoning, physical trauma, and overfeeding were chosen because they were difficult to detect during a standard autopsy. Air dissolves, insulin is processed, milk is just milk. The nursery, once a place of hope, had become a site of ritualized cruelty. Letby wasn't just killing, she was playing a game with the medical staff, a game where the stakes were the lives of children and the prize was her own sense of twisted significance. She was the hero of every tragedy. She was the one who held the grieving mothers. She was the one who laid out the tiny bodies. She was the author of the very pain she pretended to soothe. The atmosphere in the unit was no longer just heavy. It was toxic. The nurses were exhausted. The doctors were terrified. And in the center of the storm sat Lucy, her notes neat, her uniform pressed, and her eyes fixed on the next name on the roster. The sheer volume of air injected into these infants was staggering. In baby N's case, the air was forced so deep into his tissues that it caused his throat to swell, making it impossible for doctors to insert a breathing tube. The physical struggle of these infants was immense. They fought for every ounce of oxygen, their tiny hearts racing until they simply gave up. The terror of those moments, the silent screams of children who could not speak, was the dark reality behind the sterile clinical reports. The angel of death was no longer a metaphor. She was a living, breathing presence in the Countess of Chester Hospital, and she was far from finished. As the bodies of infants were being wheeled out of the neonatal unit, a different kind of darkness was taking root in the hospital's administrative wings. It was a malignancy of silence, a corporate shield forged from a desperate need to protect the institution's reputation at the cost of its patients' lives. The doctors on the front lines, specifically the lead consultants, like Dr. Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jayaram, were living in a state of hypervigilance that bordered on paranoia. They weren't just clinicians anymore. They were accidental detectives, haunted by the Letby name that appeared on every nursing roster and every resuscitation sheet like a recurring nightmare. The unease had begun as a whisper in June 2015, following the deaths of baby A, C, and D. Dr. Breary had flagged the unexplained and unusual nature of the collapses to the hospital's management, noting that a single nurse was present for every single event. He wasn't met with an urgent inquiry, but with a wall of administrative indifference. The nursing managers, including the head of the unit, Irian Powell, insisted that the data was circumstantial. They pointed to Lucy's exemplary record and her willingness to work the shifts no one else wanted. To the executives, Letby wasn't a suspect. She was a victim of a witch hunt by arrogant doctors who couldn't accept their own clinical failures. By the spring of 2016, the atmosphere in the consultant's offices was one of stifled rage. The death toll was climbing, and every time the doctors raised their voices, the hierarchy pushed back harder. The director of nursing, Karen Reese, and the chief executive, Tony Chambers, seemed more concerned with the unit's Level 2 status and the potential for a public relations disaster than the mounting pile of tiny coffins. When Dr. Breary demanded that Letby be removed from the ward after the deaths of the triplets in June, he was told that there was no evidence of foul play. The administrative response was to suggest mediation between the doctors and the nurse, as if the systematic killing of infants was a simple workplace disagreement. The most galling moment of this corporate cover-up came in early 2017. Instead of being arrested, Lucy Letby was moved to a desk job in the Risk and Patient Safety Department, a move that felt like a dark irony to the doctors who knew the truth. But the insult didn't end there. Management, backed by the Human Resources Department, determined that the consultants had bullied Letby by voicing their suspicions. In a scene that felt like it was stripped from a psychological thriller, the doctors, men who had spent their lives saving children, were ordered to write a formal letter of apology to the woman who was murdering them. They were told to sit in a room with her and clear the air, while the hospital executives looked on with satisfied expressions of conflict resolution. The frustration of the consultants was a physical weight. They were watching a predator hide in plain sight, protected by the very structures meant to ensure safety. For nearly a year after Letby was removed from the ward, the hospital refused to involve the police. They commissioned an external review by the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health, but the scope was limited. The reviewers weren't allowed to look for crime, only for service issues. Even when the review suggested that the deaths were indeed high, the board continued to stall. They didn't want the sirens. They didn't want the yellow tape. They wanted the problem to go away quietly, tucked into a file and forgotten. In the hallways of the Countess of Chester, the silence was deafening. The nurses who had worked alongside Lucy were divided, some still viewing her as a lovely girl who had been unfairly targeted, while others began to look back at the strange coincidences with a cold, creeping realization. The corporate shield was beginning to crack, not because of a sudden burst of morality from the administration, but because the doctors refused to be silenced. They bypassed the internal channels and made it clear that if the hospital wouldn't call the police, they would. It took 11 months from her removal for the sirens to finally arrive. 11 months of Letby sitting in a comfortable office, accessing confidential patient files and planning her defense, while the families of the victims remained in the dark, told that their children had died of natural causes or unfortunate complications. The prelude to Operation Hummingbird wasn't a triumph of justice. It was a testament to the lethality of institutional ego, a period where the paperwork was prioritized over the pulse. In May 2017, the sterile silence of the hospital corridors was finally pierced by the arrival of the Cheshire Constabulary. The investigation, codenamed Operation Hummingbird, was unlike anything the department had ever handled. Detectives weren't looking for a body in an alley or a weapon in a river. They were diving into a sea of medical charts, infusion pump data, and nursing rosters. The team, led by Detective Inspector Paul Hughes, moved into a secure, windowless office, filling it with whiteboards that soon became a dizzying mosaic of names, dates, and shift patterns. The breakthrough didn't come from a single smoking gun, but from a mathematical inevitability. When the investigators overlaid the times of the 17 collapses and 7 deaths with the staff schedule, a single name emerged in every single instance, occupying the center of the Venn diagram of tragedy. Lucy Letby was the only person present for every event. To the statisticians, it was an impossibility. To the detectives, it was a roadmap. On July 3rd, 2018, at 6 a.m., the Golden Girl persona was finally stripped away. The morning was cool and gray as police vehicles pulled up to the small, semi-detached house on Westbourne Road. The dawn raid was a study in jarring contrasts. Inside the home of Britain's most prolific child killer, officers found a world of arrested development. The walls were adorned with framed inspirational quotes and photos of her 2 cats, Tigger and Winnie. There were stuffed animals on the unmade bed, and a Winnie the Pooh calendar on the wall. It looked like the room of a teenager, not a 30-year-old professional. But as the forensic teams began to peel back the layers of this dollhouse existence, they found the paper mountain. Under her bed, inside a series of decorative bags, and even in her kitchen trash, were 257 confidential handover sheets, sensitive medical documents that should never have left the hospital. Some were stained with blood, others contained the minute-by-minute records of the very babies who had died under her care. She had kept them like trophies. The most chilling discovery, however, was tucked inside a green 2016 diary. It was a chaotic, scrawled post-it note, a frantic confession written in a hand that bore no resemblance to her neat clinical charts. "I am evil. I did this," the note screamed in jagged ink. "I don't deserve to live. I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough to care for them. I am a horrible, evil person." Nearby, other scraps of paper were found where she had written, "Help me," and "I can't do this anymore." It was as if the mask had slipped in the privacy of her bedroom, revealing a fractured, self-loathing psyche that found its only relief in the destruction of others. While Letby sat in a cell, maintaining a calm, almost bored demeanor during her initial interviews, the technical investigation deepened. Detectives brought in Dr. Dewey Evans, a specialized consultant with decades of experience, to review the medical records. Crucially, they gave him the charts blindly without telling him which nurses were on duty for which cases. His independent findings were harrowing. He identified air embolisms, bubbles of air deliberately injected into the bloodstream, as the cause of death for several infants. He pointed to the extraordinary levels of insulin found in others, levels that could only have been achieved through deliberate poisoning. The digital forensic team uncovered another layer of the obsession. Letby's Facebook history showed a woman who was addicted to the aftermath of her crimes. She didn't just kill the babies, she stalked their parents. She searched for the mothers on the anniversaries of their children's deaths. She searched for them on Christmas Day. On one occasion, she searched for the parents of a baby she had attacked just hours after the child was buried. She was feeding on their grief, returning to the scene of the emotional crime again and again from the safety of her smartphone. During the recorded interviews, Letby was a chameleon. She spoke in a soft, monotone voice, often answering with a simple, "I don't recall," or "I can't say." When confronted with the "I am evil" note, she claimed it was merely the product of a woman in distress who felt she was being blamed for things beyond her control. She tried to frame herself as the victim of a systemic failure, a nurse who had seen too much death and was suffering from a breakdown. But her cool, clinical responses to the details of the air embolisms suggested otherwise. She was a woman who knew the machines, knew the chemistry, and knew exactly how much accident she could manufacture. The investigation lasted years, involving over 70 officers and thousands of hours of witness statements. They tracked her movements through her cell phone pings, her swipes on the hospital security doors, and the data logs of the heart rate monitors. Every piece of evidence pointed back to the same terrifying truth. The angel was a ghost in the machine, a woman who used her intimate knowledge of the hospital's vulnerabilities to turn a house of healing into a private morgue. By the time the formal charges were brought in 2020, the detectives realized they weren't just prosecuting a nurse. They were uncovering a systematic campaign of terror that had thrived in the shadows of institutional trust. The trial at Manchester Crown Court was a marathon of misery, as the jury was forced to relive every air bubble and every spiked bag. Lucy Letby sat in the dock, a pale, diminished figure who had traded her clinical scrubs for a nondescript black cardigan. She remained largely emotionless, her face a mask of detached boredom, even as grieving parents recounted their final moments with their children just feet away. She denied every charge, maintaining that the deaths were the result of failing hospital infrastructure, a defense that eventually withered under the weight of the medical data and the damning notes found in her home. In August 2023, the verdicts finally arrived. She was found guilty of murdering 7 infants and attempting to murder 6 more. The judge, noting her deep-seated malevolence, imposed multiple whole-life orders, the most severe sentence in the British legal system. A subsequent retrial in 2024 for the attempted murder of baby K resulted in another guilty verdict, ensuring she would never again breathe the air of a free world. Justice was served, but it provided little comfort to the families whose futures she had systematically erased. The corridors of the Countess of Chester Hospital remain silent, but the weight of what happened there is far from gone. The Thirlwall Inquiry is currently dismantling the institutional walls that allowed a predator to thrive, exposing a management culture that valued its image over the pulses of the infants in its care. Lucy Letby's name has become a permanent synonym for a terrifying clinical void. She dismantled families, stole futures, and left nothing in her wake but a jagged, handwritten confession, a final, bitter testament to a tragedy that was as preventable as it was monstrous. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. Imagine holding the very evidence of your own end, recording your killer as he walks towards you across a rusted, skeletal bridge. In 2017, 14-year-old Liberty German did exactly that. She captured a grainy figure in a blue jacket, the man the world would come to know as Bridge Man. For 5 agonizing years, his voice, ordering 2 girls down the hill, haunted every corner of the internet. The terrifying paradox? The police already had his name in their files from day one. He was hiding in plain sight, just miles from the crime scene, waiting for the clock to run out. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Delphi, Indiana is the kind of place where the geography is defined more by its history than its expansion. It is a town of 3,000 souls tucked away in Carroll County, where the skyline is dominated by grain elevators and the quiet rustle of the Wabash River. A place where the communal sense of security wasn't just a feeling, it was an inheritance. On the morning of February 13th, 2017, that inheritance was still intact. The town's residents went about their business with the easy confidence of a community that hadn't seen a violent crime in decades. The concept of stranger danger felt like a relic of big city news broadcasts, something that happened in Indianapolis or Chicago, not here among the sycamores and the quiet creek beds. Liberty German and Abigail Williams were the heartbeat of this quiet landscape. Libby, at 14, was a force of nature, a girl with a camera always in hand and a mind that moved faster than the small town pace around her. She was a scholar, an athlete, and a technician of the digital age, often seen on the volleyball court or practicing her saxophone. Her home life was anchored by her grandparents, Becky and Mike German, who provided a foundation of stability in a world that Libby was eager to explore through her lens. She was the one who kept the family's technical world running, often helping her grandparents with their computers or setting up the latest gadgets. There was a specific vitality to Libby. She was always thinking about the next shot, the next angle. Then there was Abby. At 13, Abigail Williams was the quieter resonance to Libby's bright melody. She was a girl of gentle spirits and artistic leanings, possessing a kindness that her mother, Anna, described as a natural, quiet gravity. While Libby was the one leading the way with a smartphone and a plan, Abby was the steady companion, the friend who didn't need to speak to be understood. Their bond was the sort of teenage alchemy that turned a boring Monday into an adventure, forged through shared secrets and the countless hours spent navigating the transition from childhood to the threshold of something more. Abby played the trumpet in the school band and shared Libby's love for the arts, but she carried herself with a modesty that balanced Libby's more outgoing personality. The day of February 13th was an anomaly, a gift of unseasonable warmth in the middle of a Midwestern winter. The schools were closed for a scheduled winter break day, leaving the youth of Delphi with a rare afternoon of freedom. The air was crisp but lacked the usual bite of February, the thermometer hovering in the low 50s, just enough to tempt anyone out of the house and into the woods. Libby and Abby, restless and seeking the outdoors, decided on the Monon High Bridge Trail. This wasn't an unusual request. In Delphi, the trail system was considered an extension of the town's backyard. It was a place where generations of kids had walked, carved their initials into trees, and tested their courage on the heights of the old rail bridge. To the families, the idea of two girls spending a few hours in the woods was as mundane as a trip to the library. The decision to go to the bridge wasn't actually the first plan. The girls had spent the morning sleeping in and lounging, as teenagers do when a holiday grants them a reprieve from the classroom. It was only as the sun climbed higher and the temperature defied the calendar that the idea of the hike took shape. Libby's grandmother, Becky, remembered the day as one of those rare moments where the world seemed perfectly aligned. The chores were done, the house was peaceful, and the girls were in high spirits. There was a lightheartedness in the air that usually precedes a memory you want to keep forever, not a nightmare you can never escape. Becky had given her blessing, and with that, the gears of the afternoon began to turn. Kelsey German, Libby's older sister, was the one who navigated the logistics of their daily lives. On that Monday, the conversation about the bridge was casual. The weather was inviting, and the trail offered a perfect backdrop for the photos Libby loved to post on social media. When Kelsey agreed to drop them off at the trail's entrance around 1:35 in the afternoon, it was a routine favor. She watched them disappear into the trailhead, later recalling how she'd told them she loved them, a standard farewell that would soon take on the weight of a final blessing. The girls were dressed for a hike, Libby in tie-dye and sweatshirts, Abby in a light jacket. They were armed only with their phones and the invincible confidence of youth. The plan was solidified. Kelsey drops them off, and Libby's father, Derek, picks them up later. As Kelsey pulled the car away from the trailhead at the Hoosier Heartland Highway, she saw them in the rearview mirror, two figures standing at the edge of the trees, ready to plunge into the brown and gray landscape of the Indiana woods. They were small against the backdrop of the towering timber, but they were together. And in the minds of everyone who loved them, together meant safe. As they walked deeper into the woods, the sounds of the highway began to fade, replaced by the crunch of dried leaves and the distant, rhythmic call of crows. The Monon High Bridge awaited them at the end of the trail, a massive monument to a bygone era that was about to become the most analyzed location in modern criminal history. The trail leading to the Monon High Bridge is less a path and more a corridor through a fading history, a line of packed dirt and gravel that follows the ghost of the Monon Railroad, which once cut through the heart of Indiana's industrial landscape. To a stranger, the woods in mid-February might appear bleak, a skeleton of gray trunks and skeletal branches reaching toward a pale sky. No, to Libby and Abby, this was their territory. They moved with the ease of locals, their boots crunching through a carpet of dry, rusted oak leaves that had survived the winter. The air was still, save for the occasional distant hum of a tractor, or the sharp, echoing cry of a red-tailed hawk circling the creek beds. As the girls walked deeper into the woods, the world began to narrow. The trail eventually gives way to the bridge itself, a massive iron and timber structure that looms 63 feet above the waters of Deer Creek. It is 853 feet of history, standing as a testament to the engineering of the late 1800s, now surrendered to the elements. The Monon High Bridge is not for the faint of heart. It has no handrails, no safety netting, only the weathered wooden railroad ties spaced unevenly, with gaps that allow a clear, dizzying view of the rocky creek bed below. The physical sensation of being on that bridge is one of intense isolation. On a windy day, the iron vibrates, a low-frequency hum that travels from the soles of your shoes up through your spine. To cross it, you must focus. You have to watch where your feet land, ensuring you don't slip on the moss-slicked wood or trip over the rusted spikes that still jut out from the timber. For teenagers in Delphi, crossing the bridge was a rite of passage, a test of nerves that yielded the ultimate reward, a vantage point where you could see for miles over the rolling Indiana timberland. At 2:07 in the afternoon, Libby pulled out her phone. She was a child of the digital age, understanding instinctively that a moment wasn't just lived, it was captured. She opened Snapchat and took a photo of Abby. In the image, Abby is walking away from the camera, her head tilted down as she watches her footing on the precarious ties. She's wearing a light-colored jacket, her hands partially tucked into her sleeves against the afternoon chill. There is nothing in the frame to suggest terror. No shadow looming in the background. Just a girl on a bridge, framed by the stark brown beauty of the woods. It is a hauntingly quiet image, the final digital footprint of a peaceful afternoon. But the bridge is a dead end. Once you reach the far side, the southeast end, the tracks simply vanish into a wall of private property and dense tangled brush. There is no easy exit. To leave, you must either turn around and walk back the way you came, facing whoever might be following you, or you must descend the steep, treacherous embankments that lead down to the water. The geography itself is a trap. It was shortly after that final photo that the atmosphere changed. The rhythmic sound of their own footsteps was joined by another, a heavier, more deliberate gait. A man had appeared at the north end of the bridge, beginning his walk toward them. He didn't look like a hiker. He didn't have the gear or the light-hearted stride of someone out to enjoy the unseasonable warmth. He was a discordant note in a familiar song. He wore a blue-gray windbreaker, flared at the waist as if overstuffed, and a pair of blue jeans that looked several sizes too large, bunching at the ankles. A brown hoodie was pulled up, partially obscured by a cap. Libby, with a chillingly mature intuition, sensed the danger before it became physical. She didn't put her phone away. Instead, she switched from photos to video, holding the device at her side, capturing the man's approach without him knowing. In the grainy, stabilized footage, we see him, the bridge man. He walks with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his head down, looking at the ties. His stride is heavy, purposeful, the walk of a man who knows exactly where the bridge ends and where the girls are trapped. The video captures more than just his image. It captures the sound of the woods being violated. As he closes the distance, the wind dies down, leaving a heavy, expectant silence. Then, a voice. It isn't a scream or a cinematic snarl. It is a low, gravelly command that sounds terrifyingly mundane, like a neighbor telling you to move out of the way. He utters the words that would be analyzed by the FBI and millions of onlookers for the next half-decade. Guys, down the hill. In those 4 words, the hike ended. The girls were forced off the safety of the iron structure and pushed toward the steep, muddy incline that led toward the creek. The terrain there is punishing, thick with brambles and hidden roots, the ground soft with the thaw of February. As they descended down the hill, they were moving away from the trail, away from the sightline of any potential witnesses, and into the deep, shadowed silence of the valley. The man followed, leaving the bridge empty. The rusted iron standing silent once again, holding only the echoes of the command that had just shattered 2 families. The command was not a shout. It was a cold, efficient directive that stripped the afternoon of its remaining warmth. When the man in the blue-gray jacket uttered those 4 words, "Guys, down the hill!" the girls were forced to abandon the relative visibility of the high bridge's iron skeleton. They were ushered toward the southeast embankment, a place where the earth drops away in a steep, punishing grade of mud and tangled brush. This was no longer a hike, it was a forced march into the shadows. The descent was treacherous, the kind of terrain where every step is a gamble against gravity, yet they were being driven by a presence that allowed for no hesitation. As they reached the bottom of the incline, the landscape transformed. They were no longer overlooking the valley, they were buried within it. The sound of the wind through the upper branches was replaced by the low, steady gurgle of Deer Creek, a body of water that, in February, is a freezing slate-gray ribbon of ice and snowmelt. To move forward, they were forced into the water. The creek at that point is not deep, but the current is insistent, and the bed is a chaotic arrangement of slick stones and hidden drop-offs. The cold would have been instantaneous, a biting, numbing sensation that soaked through their boots and climbed their legs, turning their muscles heavy and slow. On the other side of the creek lay a private woodlot, a secluded bottoms area where the trees grow thick and the sightlines to any road or trail are completely severed. It was here, in a hollow shielded by the rising banks and the dense timber, that the encounter reached its final, horrific climax. The world outside continued to move. Cars passed on the Hoosier Heartland Highway, and neighbors in nearby houses went about their Monday routines. But in this specific pocket of the woods, the silence was absolute. Whatever transpired occurred in a window of time so narrow it defies the imagination, a brutal disruption of reality that left the woods forever changed. By 3:11 p.m., the first ripple of concern reached the trailhead. Derek German, Libby's father, pulled his vehicle into the designated pickup spot near the old North Fitzpatrick Road. He was on time, expecting to see two wind-blown teenagers emerging from the trees, perhaps complaining about the cold or showing off photos from their trek. But the trailhead was empty. He waited, the engine idling, the minutes ticking past the agreed-upon time. He dialed Libby's cell phone. It rang and rang, the rhythmic, mechanical tone eventually giving way to the impersonal prompt of her voicemail. He called again and again. The initial annoyance of a parent waiting on a tardy child quickly began to curdle into something sharper. Derek knew Libby was responsible, and more importantly, he knew she was tethered to her phone. For her to miss a call was rare. For her to miss multiple calls was a signal. He began to walk a short distance into the woods, calling their names. The trees offered no response. By 3:30 p.m., he contacted the rest of the family. The communal sense of together means safe was the first thing to shatter. If they were together and still not answering, they weren't just lost, they were incapacitated. By late afternoon, the German and Williams families had converged on the trail. What had begun as a private search escalated with terrifying speed. They fanned out across the paths, their voices echoing through the timber, calling for Libby and Abby until their throats were raw. They checked the bridge. They looked over the sides into the dizzying heights. They scoured the creek banks. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the leaf litter, the unseasonable warmth of the day evaporated. The temperature began to plummet, returning to the harsh reality of an Indiana winter. By 5:30 p.m., the local authorities were officially notified. The Delphi Police Department and the Carroll County Sheriff's Office arrived, but their initial assessment was hampered by the very nature of the town. This was Delphi. Kids drifted off trails all the time. They got lost, they stayed out too late, or their phones died. There was a lingering hope, a desperate, flickering thing, that the girls had simply walked too far and come out at a different trailhead, or were sitting in a local diner waiting for a ride. But as the golden hour passed and darkness began to swallow the woods, the scale of the emergency became undeniable. The night search was a masterpiece of community desperation. Hundreds of volunteers from Delphi and the surrounding counties arrived with flashlights and thermal scanners. The woods were transformed into a sea of bobbing lights, a grid of human effort trying to pierce the pitch-black Indiana night. Firefighters, police officers, and neighbors moved in line formations, their boots heavy in the mud, their breaths blooming in the freezing air. They pushed through thickets and navigated the treacherous bridge in the dark, calling out into a void that refused to speak back. Every ping of a cell phone tower was analyzed. Every distant sound, the snap of a branch or the rustle of a nocturnal animal, brought the searchers to a breathless halt. But the girls remained ghosts. Around midnight, under the advice of law enforcement, and due to the extreme danger posed by the terrain in the dark, the formal search was officially called off until daybreak. It was a decision that felt like a betrayal to the families. They were told to go home, to wait for the light, while their daughters were out in the freezing dark, somewhere down the hill. That night, the town of Delphi didn't sleep. Lights stayed on in every window along the quiet streets. The silence of the town was heavy, thick with the realization that the safety they had taken for granted was an illusion. The bridge was still there, a massive iron shadow in the woods, holding the secret of what had happened in the 2 minutes and 13 seconds since Libby had pressed record. The morning was coming, and with it, a discovery that would ensure the people of Delphi would never look at their woods or their neighbors the same way again. The scale of the search had ballooned overnight. Hundreds of volunteers, some who had traveled from 3 counties away, gathered at the command post. There was a desperate, hushed energy in the air, the sound of hundreds of boots shuffling through gravel and the low, urgent crackle of police radios. They were organized into tighter, more systematic grids. The hope that the girls were simply lost was being systematically dismantled by the sheer passage of time and the plummeting temperatures. No 2 teenage girls, no matter how resourceful, would choose to stay out in this freezing Indiana dampness unless they had no choice. By late morning, the focus narrowed toward the area east of the high bridge. Searchers fanned out along both sides of Deer Creek, moving through the dense timber of the private woodlots that bordered the water. The terrain was punishing, thick with thorn bushes that tore at clothing and steep, muddy embankments that threatened to send anyone sliding toward the gray, rushing water below. The silence of the woods was profound, broken only by the calling of names, voices that were growing increasingly hoarse and ragged as the hours ticked toward noon. At approximately 12:15 p.m., the world in Delphi stopped turning. A group of searchers on the north bank of Deer Creek, roughly half a mile upstream from the bridge, came to a sudden, petrified halt. They had spotted something in a secluded hollow, an area heavily shielded by the curve of the bank and the density of the old-growth timber. First, it was a glimpse of color that didn't belong in the brown and gray winter landscape, a piece of clothing. Then, the full reality of the scene came into focus. The bodies of Liberty German and Abigail Williams were found on private property, roughly 50 feet from the water's edge. They were still, framed by the cold earth and the silent trees, a sight that would haunt the volunteers for the rest of their lives. The initial reaction was a crushing, absolute silence, followed by a wave of radio transmissions that were thick with shock and grief. "We have found them," was the message that rippled through the search lines, but the tone of the voice told the rest of the town what they didn't want to hear. This wasn't a rescue. Within minutes, the area was flooded with law enforcement. The wooded hollow was quickly cordoned off with yellow tape, a bright, artificial barrier that marked the boundary between the peaceful world of Delphi and a theater of unimaginable violence. The crime scene itself was an island of stillness. The girls had been found in a location that suggested they had been led there with intent, away from the eyes of the world and the safety of the trail. The details of the scene were immediately guarded by the authorities with a level of secrecy that was almost unprecedented. They didn't speak of the cause of death. They didn't describe the state of the victims. This silence served two purposes: to protect the integrity of the investigation and to shield the families from a level of horror that no one should have to visualize. However, the presence of the FBI and the immediate arrival of state crime lab technicians signaled that this was not an accident or a tragedy of the elements. It was a double homicide. The atmosphere in the town shifted from frantic hope to a paralyzed, vibrating fear. As the news of the grim discovery broke, the streets of Delphi emptied. Parents rushed to schools to pick up their children. Doors that had gone unlocked for decades were bolted and barred. The realization was as cold as the creek water. The girls had been captured by a predator who was likely still out there. The bridge, once a place of local pride and teenage adventure, was now a monument to a massacre. It loomed over the valley like a skeletal sentinel, a silent witness to the final minutes of Libby and Abby. As the bodies were respectfully recovered and transported for autopsies, the investigation began to take its first faltering steps. The police had a timeline, they had a location, and, unknown to the public at that exact moment, they had the voice and the image of the killer. But as the sun set on that first day of the new reality, the fog didn't lift. It only grew thicker. The search was over, but the hunt for the man who had walked across the iron ties was only just beginning. The community of Delphi had lost more than two of its daughters. It had lost its soul, replaced by a lingering, toxic suspicion that the monster they were looking for might be the person standing next to them in the grocery line. The investigation into the deaths of Libby and Abby was not a sprint. It was a war of attrition against a phantom that had left behind the ultimate piece of evidence, yet remained utterly invisible. Within 48 hours of the discovery, the Indiana State Police released a still image captured from Libby German's phone. It was the Bridge Man, a grainy, pixelated figure caught mid-stride on the rusted iron ties. A few days later, they released the audio. The world heard that gravelly command tone voice for the first time. It was a digital ghost, a Rorschach test for a terrified public. To some, he looked like a local farmer. To others, a drifter. To the investigators sitting in the makeshift task force headquarters at the Delphi United Methodist Church, he was a puzzle that refused to be solved despite having a face and a voice. The first few months were defined by a staggering volume of information. Tips poured in by the thousands, over 50,000 in the first few years alone. The FBI, the state police, and the local sheriff's department were drowning in a sea of names, theories, and lookalikes. Every man in Carroll County who owned a blue jacket and walked with a slight hitch was scrutinized. The town of Delphi became a place of whispers. People stopped looking at the woods and started looking at their neighbors' driveways. They noticed whose lights stayed on late, who stopped going to the local grocery store, and who suddenly decided to wash their truck in the middle of a winter freeze. The first major red herring that gripped the investigation and the public's imagination was the property where the girls were found. Ron Logan, the elderly owner of the farm that bordered Deer Creek, became the center of a forensic hurricane. To many, the logic seemed inescapable. The girls were on his land, and he had a history of minor legal troubles. The FBI executed massive search warrants on his home, his outbuildings, and his trash. They analyzed his alibi, which involved a trip to a nearby town to buy tropical fish. Despite the intensity of the scrutiny, the evidence simply wasn't there. Logan would eventually pass away years later, his name still tethered to a crime he likely didn't commit, a victim of the investigation's desperate need for a tangible villain. Then came the sketches, the most controversial and confusing element of the 5-year hunt. In July 2017, the police released a composite drawing of an older man, perhaps in his 50s, with a goatee and a prominent cap. This became the face of the killer for nearly 2 years. But in April 2019, the investigation took what Superintendent Doug Carter called a new direction. At a cinematic high-tension press conference, the older sketch was tossed aside in favor of a younger man, a figure appearing to be in his 20s or 30s, with curly hair and a more slender build. The public was told that the killer was likely between the ages of 18 and 40, and that he might be hiding in plain sight, possibly even in the room during the press conference. This pivot created a massive schism in the search. Was there one man? Two? Was the sketch a composite of witnesses or a specific individual? The confusion fueled a burgeoning community of online sleuths who began to target anyone who resembled either drawing. This digital vigilantism led to the harassment of dozens of innocent men, turning the investigation into a chaotic, multi-headed beast. The police, meanwhile, were pivoting toward a digital lead that seemed to promise a breakthrough, the Anthony_Shots profile. Investigators discovered that a fake social media profile, using the photos of a male model, had been communicating with Libby German in the days leading up to the hike. The profile was traced back to Keegan Kline, a young man living in nearby Peru, Indiana. For a moment, it seemed the ghost had been caught. The connection between online grooming and the physical location of the murders was too strong to ignore. The task force spent years diving into the dark corners of Kline's digital life. But the direct link to the Monon High Bridge remained elusive. It was another labyrinthine dead end that ate up thousands of man-hours while the real bridge man continued his life in Delphi. The true tragedy of the investigation, however, was not what the police couldn't find. It was what they already had. In the chaotic first days of the search, in February 2017, a local man had reached out to a conservation officer. He didn't call the tip line. He met the officer in a grocery store parking lot. He admitted he had been on the Monon High Bridge on the afternoon of the 13th. He told the officer he was there between 1:30 and 3:30 p.m. He even described his clothing, a blue-gray jacket and blue jeans. He mentioned seeing 3 juvenile females on the trail. This man was Richard Allen. Through a catastrophic clerical error, this interview was misfiled or ignored. Because the conservation officer was not part of the primary investigative team, his notes were reportedly labeled as cleared or simply lost in a mounting pile of paper. For 5 years, the name of a man who placed himself at the scene, wearing the killer's clothes during the exact window of the murders, sat in a file cabinet. Richard Allen didn't flee Delphi. He didn't go into hiding. He continued to work as a pharmacy technician at the local CVS, the very place where the victims' families went to pick up their prescriptions. He processed their photos. He chatted with them across the counter. He was the ultimate ghost, the one who never left. It wasn't until 2022 when a fresh pair of eyes, reportedly a volunteer or a new clerk reorganizing the digital archives, came across the original 2017 interview notes. The realization was a thunderclap. The details provided by Allen 5 years earlier perfectly matched the witness statements and the footage on Libby's phone. The investigation, which had traveled thousands of miles across digital footprints and out-of-state leads, suddenly collapsed back onto a small brick house on Whiteman Drive in the heart of Delphi. The ghost hunt was over. The reality of the man in the blue jacket was finally coming to light, and it was far more mundane and far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. In October 2022, the 5-year stalemate shattered when police executed a search warrant on Richard Allen's home. They didn't find a bloody trophy room. They found a family man living a life of quiet suburban invisibility. But in a drawer, they recovered a Sig Sauer P226, a weapon that forensic experts linked to a single, unspent .40 caliber round found in the dirt between Libby and Abby's bodies. The tool mark analysis became the centerpiece of a trial that began in late 2024, exposing a narrative far more twisted than a simple chance encounter. The defense fought back with a sprawling theory of ritualistic sacrifice involving Odinism, but the prosecution countered with a devastating blow. Allen had reportedly confessed to the murders more than 60 times during recorded prison calls to his wife. On November 11, 2024, the jury delivered their verdict. Richard Allen was found guilty on all counts of murder, finally putting a face to the ghost that had haunted the Mononhai Bridge, and ensuring the man in the blue jacket would never walk free again. Delphi. Today is no longer defined by a ghost, but by the resilience of those who stayed behind. The Abigail and Liberty Memorial Park stands as a sanctuary of playgrounds and ball fields where children's laughter fills the air that was once thick with terror. The command down the hill has lost its power to frighten, replaced by the legacy of Libby's courage, the presence of mind that ensured a killer's face would be known to the world. The woods are quiet now. The iron bridge remains still.